Tell me. All right. That must be our go-ahead sign. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be today. We're in Washington, D.C. at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. It's my pleasure to welcome you. I'm the Executive Officer of the National Academy of Medicine and Executive Director of the Leadership Consortium for a Value and Science-Driven Health System. We're here gathered as part of our Evidence Mobilization Action Collaborative, and I'll introduce our two co-chairs of the collaborative in just a moment. And our focus today is on the issue of stewarding public trust in biomedical science and research. As we look across the board at the challenges for society, clearly issues related to equity rank at the top, but they're followed closely by issues related to trust in science, because our scientific enterprise is actually fairly robust and productive, and developing the kind of initiatives that can transform the human condition in many ways, but in order to ensure that that robust capacity is in fact enabled and implemented, the notion of trust in science is clearly key. That's a complex issue. Hence, it's an issue that is quite suitable for us in the national academies to work with you who are on the front lines of trust in science, to engage and to learn from you and to be guided by your insights. Hence today's session. This is just one contribution to a large national and international debate on the issue, but it's one that is deserving of the full attention of society at every level. So the essential objective for our conversation today is, as indicated and will be elaborated on by our two co-chairs, is to assess, understand, and grow public trust in health research and the evidence it generates, and in particular, offering lessons for those of us in the national academies, working with our colleagues in the scientific leadership community across the globe on ways in which we can identify effective strategies, effective messages, effective messengers, and work in a strategic fashion to improve the state of play. The motivating questions that we'll be considering today, you'll hear more about in just a minute, but they relate to reviewing the profile of public distrust and trust in health research and science. What have been the trends in that respect? What are the consequences that we'll be engaging and are engaging now? Very much engaging in real time as we look at the dependence of progress in COVID-19 on trust in science and the scientific enterprise. What is the sense of urgency, the speed at which the issues are changing? How do we ensure that transparency is part of our solution and not part of our problem? What trust-enhancing strategies have been tried and are offering some semblance of effectiveness? We have a really terrific group of participants, both formally on the agenda and informally as part of the webinar, who will introduce along the way. I will introduce in just about 2 minutes Rick Kuntz and Rich Platt, who are the co-chairs of the collaborative. But before doing so, I'll run quickly through the background context of the organization, the National Academy of Medicine. Next slide, please. And the Leadership Consortium. The Leadership Consortium is comprised of the kinds of organizations which are necessary to work together to advance trust in science. These are stakeholder leaders in public, private, independent organizations from the key health sectors. They collaborate under our auspices and collaborate on the common interests of advancing effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and continuous learning in health, medical care, and biomedical science. Next slide, please. They together work under the big tent of advancing a learning health system, one in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement, innovation, and equity. And trust is a common feature throughout all of those as an important either tool or rate limiting factor. And the extent to which they are aligned in implementation is a function of the trust factor. Next slide, please. So the focus is collaboration for action. And the topic of our focus today is obviously one perhaps at the highest point of our priority list that is most important for collaborative action. Next slide, please. The action that we steward is stewarded through 4 action collaboratives, one on science, one on informatics, one on incentives, and one on culture. They are obviously overlapping in their spirit and in their activities and the aligning of initiative within and among these action collaborative arenas is a critical point of the strategy involved. In the science arena, we seek continuous learning through real world evidence. In informatics, building digital infrastructure and data is a core utility. In incentives, payment based on health outcomes for people and populations. And in culture, full and equitable health engagement for people and communities. And again, you can see instinctively the fundamental importance of trust in science and the capacity of the scientific enterprise as an essential element in each of those arenas. Next slide, please. Each of the collaborative works with organizational networks, organizational stakeholders, works around anchor principles. Again, one of the strategic interests is in building trust in those principles and the cooperative effort across organizations. And we also use a series of progress indicators to track the extent to which we are moving in the right direction, and we do so through collaborative projects. Next slide, please. One of the major activities of the past year, naturally, year and a half, has been using our stakeholder network. That is to say, we have leaders in organizations who represent 9 different sectors in our health system: clinicians, payers, research, digital health, public health, patients and families, and communities, care systems, quality, safety, and standards organizations, health product manufacturers, and innovators. The heads of those 9 sectors have teamed with their colleagues in looking intensively over the last year at the impact of COVID-19 on their sectors, and that series of assessments has now largely been completed, and we're moving into looking at how cooperative effort to implement cross-cutting opportunities for health transformation. And it's clear again, if you look at every one of those sectors, that a rate limiting factor is the extent to which we can foster trust in science and not just trust, but demand for orientation to scientific and objective approaches to progress. So next slide, please. That's the background of today's meeting organizationally and a little bit on the issue of the specific importance of trust. We are committed to addressing the cross-cutting issues that have been identified by the sector assessments. And as mentioned, this is at the top of the agenda. So we're very much appreciative of your being with us. And we're certainly appreciative of the efforts of our leaders in this. Rick Kuntz, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical and Scientific Officer at Medtronic, and Rich Platt, Chair of the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard University and President of the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. Thanks to both of you. Let me turn the session over to Rick.
Thank you, Michael. On behalf of my co-chair, Rich, and myself, we're very excited about this session. This is a very timely topic to discuss. In my own experience in academia, both and in industry, the chain of trust, as it were, really does start from solid evidence, which is disseminated to providers, and then the trust in the providers and the evidence really disseminates to patients. I think what we've all discovered is that there has been a history of mistrust in the past, but it's been accelerated by COVID in many ways. And again, in my own experience in the company that I belong to, I often have to deal with employees who are asking questions about vaccinations and so on. And it was a real eye-opener to really understand the different views about biomedical research and the trust they have in them, especially with competing different sources of information, which are more ubiquitous now than they were in the past. And the inability in some cases to distinguish between solid sources of information versus those that are not solid at all. So we're very excited about exploring this session. And if we can go to the next slide, I can review the agenda. In the next session, our speakers will provide an overview of distrust in biomedical research before and then leading up to COVID-19, mainly highlighting the history of distrust among a few stakeholder groups, particularly distrust within the research community and distrust on marginalized populations. So I think that's going to be a really important session. Following this, we'll begin to drill down on specific dimensions of distrust that have emerged, starting with challenges of maintaining scientific integrity while simultaneously trying to respond to demand for innovative solutions. Next, we'll shift gears to focus on a broader political context in society and its influence on misuse of social media as a tool to spread misinformation and how it could be used responsibly and interplay between those two factors. I think that would be really an exciting session. Then we invite all panelists from the preceding sessions to participate in a discussion to identify potential strategies and solutions to address these dimensions and close the trust gap, as it were. And that's going to be an important goal of this session, is to understand how to close that trust gap. And to wrap up, we'll hear from key takeaways from panelists and my co-chair and myself and Michael on presentations and discussions held throughout the meeting. And then hopefully we'll be able to put together at least the beginning of a clear call to action that we can initiate, and then we'll go from there. So that's a high-level overview of the session. I think, again, it's going to be super exciting and informative. And with that, let me turn it over to my co-chair, Rich, who will provide some of the logistics of the meeting.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, everyone, for joining. In the history of our evidence collaborative, we have put the emphasis on trying to understand how a learning health system can develop evidence. Today we're talking about how do we deal with a situation in which we think we have evidence, or at least we have better evidence today than we did yesterday, and yet there is no good audience for that evidence. And that's this is as important a topic as I think we've ever discussed in this forum, in the national. Couldn't have a better group of panelists and people participating in the audience to try to wrestle with that. I surely hope we can think about a way to attack the problem. Our goal is to have this be as interactive a next few hours as possible, and so I encourage everyone to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to enter questions. We have time after every session for discussion, and we'll handle as many of the questions that come in box as we possibly can, and we'll attempt to do a follow-up of everything, even if we don't have time. Really encourage everyone to weigh in on. Okay, that's the full instructions, and now we're ready to dive in. So, Rick, back to you.
Thanks, Rich. So our first session will be called Overview of Trust and Distrust in Biomedical Research from a high-level view. And we're privileged to have our speakers today, Carrie Funk from the Pew Research Center, Siddharth Parikh from the American Association of Advancement of Science, and Sandra Quinn from the University of Maryland School of Public Health. What we want to do is essentially explore these various factors influencing public trust and provide a detailed background on longstanding issues of distrust among the general public and cascading effects on the specific communities. So this is going to be kind of an overview of the framework of how trust is built and how it might be eroded. With that, I'd like to invite members of the panel as well as the audience to submit questions for Q&A. So as Rich just said, we can keep this very fluid and interactive. We'll have each speaker talk for between 7 and 10 minutes, and then we'll follow up with the reactions and questions. So with that, I'll start off by asking Carrie to start with the first talk.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I'm just going to walk you through a couple of findings from Pew Research Center surveys that highlight what we know about where public trust sits, and in particular, where it tends to be stronger and weaker, because so many of these conversations about needing to build or rebuild trust, it's not so much about the public as a whole. It's really a focus on which segments of the public have stronger or weaker trust and where that might need some remediation. I would just point out that the center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization, and our role is really to help diagnose public trust in science and medical science and the factors driving it. And so I think that hopefully will be a foundation for the conversation through the day as we're trying to think about how to be better stewards of trust in science and health research. Go ahead and go to our first slide. I want to just start with why we talk so much about trust in science in the broader community here. And I think the coronavirus pandemic is a great example, a pressing example of why the scientific community is so focused on trust. Partly because we're often looking at what are our general metrics about trust in scientists and trust in medical scientists as a bellwether for what happens in specific circumstances, like the ones we're in right now, right? So this is an indicator of people's confidence in the vaccine research and development process just over the past outbreak. And what you see actually is that there's been a growth in the share who have this strongest level of trust in the vaccine R&D process. You want to pay attention to the darker blue, which is the share saying they have a great deal of confidence. So that went from about 19-20% early on in September 2020 to about double that, another 20 points up to 39% as of August 21. So that's the big picture of public trust in the vaccine process. The issue is that this smaller segment we're not showing there, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. The issue is that that smaller segment who has lower levels of trust, about 27%, they are most likely not vaccinated, right? There's a very strong correlation between people's confidence in the vaccine R&D process and their own vaccination status. And that's what you're seeing down below on this slide. So that's, I think, just an example of why we talk about this so much. Go ahead and go to the next slide, I think. And I just want to call attention to some of the challenges that we're facing at this moment, because this is a hard time for science communication. The pandemic has also highlighted some of those chief hurdles, particularly around the changing information environment. So we've seen really rapid scientific developments. As a public, we're seeing a lens into the R&D process. We're seeing a lens into the role of public health officials, all of which are operating in the public eye and before probably largely out of the public eye. But it's also one where, of course, we've been learning a lot over time and a lot of things have changed. So one of the things we did in this most recent survey in August 21 was ask people about their reactions to the changing public health guidance over time. And we gave them a series of statements. Each row here is essentially a separate question. And we asked whether they had that reaction or didn't have that reaction to the statement. So on the top row, what you see is about 6 in 10 Americans said that they saw those changing public health guidelines as understandable because scientific knowledge is constantly being updated. And that really aligns with other questions we've asked over the years. About 2/3 of Americans saying that they're aware scientific research is iterative and meant to be continually updated over time. But at the same time, people have other reactions too. So you also see about half of the public saying that it made them feel confused. And some around half basically saying that they had really more negative reactions to this changing public health guidance. Either it made them wonder about transparency of information or just made them less confident in the recommendations. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So then that gets us to the big picture of where does public trust in scientists and medical scientists stand? And this is one of our kind of general metrics that we use to gauge this over time. On the left-hand side, you see people were being asked about their confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public, and on the right-hand side, in medical scientists. So from that national lens, I would say that we're seeing majorities of Americans have a positive bent towards scientists and their work. You actually see the same pattern for the two groups. And I'm just going to focus on trust in medical scientists here. You also see a little uptick in public trust or confidence in medical scientists since the pandemic began, or the outbreak began. In January of 2019, would have been our before the pandemic measure, 35% of Americans said they had a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the public interest. That ticked up just a bit. In the most recent survey, it was 40% saying that. So again, I'm focusing on that share with the strongest level of trust as a marker of that. You can also see here the lighter blue color. That's what we call kind of the share with a soft positive orientation towards medical scientists. So there's also quite a few people who have that kind of soft level of confidence or trust in medical scientists. It's really just a small share, 14% in the most recent time we asked about this, that had really what we'd call as a negative view, saying they have not too much or no trust at all in medical scientists. Next slide, please. As it turns out, as we're talking about, it's the segments that matter, because that uptick in public trust in scientists is not uniform across all Americans. So what you're seeing here is one of the biggest changes is that we're seeing Democrats in particular on the far right hand they're the ones who have seen the biggest growth in their confidence in medical scientists. So before the pandemic, 37% of Democrats had a great deal of confidence in medical scientists. That ticked up to 53, 54% in the more recent surveys. In the middle panels, what you're seeing is among Republicans, confidence in medical scientists has stayed roughly the same or maybe trending downward. We'll have to see what happens the next time we ask about this. But so that stayed roughly the same. And what that means is, as a result, we're seeing a greater division between Democrats and Republicans over their level of confidence in medical scientists than we saw before. And that's, I think, especially noticeable because as we've asked about lots of different questions about medical scientists, medical doctors, medical researchers, we usually see a small or really no difference by partisan lens in how people react to these groups. So this is a fairly new development. And of course, it has implications for how we think about communication and engagement with science going forward. Go ahead and move us forward, please. Now, I didn't want to leave us with just that general metric of confidence in scientists and their work, because many people like to think about science as being, trust as being multifaceted, having multiple dimensions. We've done a lot of things over the years to try to unpack people's trust in scientists, and in particular to kind of probe where the sources of mistrust might be coming from. So this data is coming from 2019. It's one of the things we did to try to do that. I'm going to focus just on people's judgments and views around medical doctors on the left-hand side and medical research scientists on the right-hand side. Again, each row is a question, so we're summarizing quite a lot of data here. But what we wanted to do, what we were struck by in the overall picture is the contrast between people's relatively positive orientation towards, let's say, we can start with medical doctors, competence, how they do their job, their caring about patients, about the public generally, their trust in information. And then down below, what we see as a good deal of shared skepticism around issues of ethics and scientific integrity. So let me just run through one of these findings so that you know what you're looking at. We're showing that 49% of Americans said that medical doctors do a good job all or most of the time. And then just contrasting that down below with 15% of Americans said doctors are transparent all or most of the time about potential conflicts of interest with industry ties. You see a fairly similar and small share saying that medical doctors would admit their mistakes that they had made and take responsibility for them all or most of the time. And then should professional or research misconduct occur, the last question is whether or not doctors or researchers would face serious consequences for any misconduct. So there too, you see no more than about 2 in 10 Americans saying that that would be the case. So our takeaway from this data is that Americans are generally pretty cautious, or you might even say suspicious, around issues of ethics and integrity in scientific institutions. At the same time, obviously, there's also a good bit of positive orientation and views of these groups. So take us to the last slide. I just wanted to make one more point from this to cue up our conversation for the rest of the afternoon. There it is. Because one of the things that happens when people are talking about the need in particular to rebuild trust in biomedical science and research, we're often thinking about the need, particularly among Black Americans. And there's lots of data that can show this. We have data, lots of other people have data. And the point is really that there are long-standing differences in how Americans see biomedical science by race and ethnicity. I'm going to just point out the middle row here, which is coming from that same survey that we asked in 2019, where you're seeing that about 6 in 10 each of Black and Hispanic adults said that research misconduct in by medical research scientists is either a very or moderately big problem. the comparison with white adults is 42%. You also see on the top row that Black adults, followed by Hispanic adults, are less likely to think that science has had a positive effect on society overall. A comparatively larger share of these groups see science as having a mix of both negative and positive effects on society. So with that, I just wanted to tee up the rest of our conversation as we hear more from Sandra Quinn and I think others this afternoon who can talk about the ongoing need to rebuild trust in Black communities and other communities of color around the nation. And I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Carrie. That was fantastic. We'll go to the next speaker, and then we'll have at the end of the three speakers the open discussion. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions for Carrie. With that, let me turn it over to Sudip.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks, Carrie. That data is always just really, really enlightening. So I am Sudip Parikh, and I do have the privilege of leading the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so when I talk today, I'm going to talk from the viewpoint of an organization that is responsible for disseminating scientific information and results, mostly to the scientific community, but also to the public. And then also an organization that runs many programs to build trust between scientists and what I'd call influencers in the community. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So the reasons, if you look at the relationship between science and society before the pandemic, scientists, if you look at that data in general, it's actually pretty good compared to other institutions and other professions, right? Trust in scientists and in medical research is higher than most other institutions. And we felt pretty good about that in 2019. We felt pretty good about it. And even when there were discussions going on in the research community about something, a disagreement, those didn't spill over into mistrust. So for example, there was a pretty big argument about who achieved quantum supremacy in computing. And there were some companies that really took issue with each other, and it didn't lower trust in computing, right? There's a pretty big argument going on in the field of superconductivity about what temperature you can achieve superconductivity. And again, it didn't lower trust in the science because it was a disagreement in fields that weren't directly affecting people. Biomedical research is just a completely different thing because it touches on people's lives. And so what we've seen is that when there's a disagreement in the field in something esoteric, reaction mechanism, again, that doesn't bother anybody about the science. They just say, well, they'll work it out and they'll figure it out. But as we've gone through the pandemic, and it's been incredibly messy as people see hypotheses being put up and tested, it has led to this confusion that Carrie talked about. But it's also shed a light on the fact that people misunderstand the parts of the scientific enterprise that is for disseminating information. So, for example, we have the way that scientists are interacting with one another has changed drastically in the last 20 years. When I was a graduate student, if I got my issue of Science or Nature or Cell or JBC, I would open it up and I would find the paper that I cared about. I'd flip through and I'd maybe tear out a paper and share it with others. And those were sort of, they'd already been peer reviewed. They'd already gone through some processes to do first checks. Now they're not always right, and there are arguments. But now we have scientists interacting in much more open form in a way that is very valuable to the scientific community. We have things like bioRxiv and others where we're putting preprints, and that is incredibly valuable to the scientific community. And AAAS is incredibly supportive of these activities. The challenge becomes that when you bring general beat reporters into reporting about biomedical research and about science, they don't have a feel for the difference between what is a preprint, what's a press release, what is a peer-reviewed paper, and then what is a peer-reviewed paper that's been tested and replicated. They don't have a feel for that. And so it became very challenging as literally thousands of beat reporters who have been writing on other subjects turned to talking about COVID. And so at AAAS, we responded in several ways. First is when you publish a paper in Science or the Science family of journals, we have science writers that work with our professional editors to turn the scientific language into lay language for reporters, for dissemination, and increasingly to turn it into tweets and posts and social media disseminations, because for anybody who's younger than me, that is the primary way in which they're getting information first. Even among scientists, I can tell you who's looking at Science magazine by the way they come in. If they look at it through the online ebook, that's going to be somebody older than me. If it's somebody that looks at it through PubMed, that's probably somebody my age. If it's somebody who looks at it and comes at it through Twitter, those are graduate students and postdocs and young faculty that are younger than me. It's easy to figure out, and so we're making sure that we're curating and disseminating to each of those audiences with well-written communications that are accurate, but sometimes lose a little bit of precision. Because one of the enemies to our ability to be connected to our communities is jargon. And jargon is incredibly important for all of us in being precise with one another. But jargon is an enemy to communication to the public. I spent 9 years working in Congress, and every time jargon is what disrupted the flow of communication back and forth. So that, we do that through the dissemination through this lay language work. We also do it through reaching out directly to reporters that are science reporters, so that they write the first stories, and then those get disseminated through others, and make their way cascading through the media channels. It's not perfect. The reason it's not perfect is because once it's out there in the ether, the information is so democratized now in the social media space that pieces out of context can be taken and become part of echo chambers. And we try very hard to actually have responses to that, particularly for papers that are published in Science. But that is, it's hard to do for, we only publish 6 journals. If you do thousands, as many of our commercial publishers do, very hard to keep up with that. The next place that we work on this is then on the programmatic side, where we say, how can we help general beat reporters? The first thing we've done is create a database of vetted scientists around the country who are willing and able to respond on deadline. We have to work on the timeline of journalists, not on our timelines. And they would much rather hear from if you're a person writing for a paper in Jefferson City, Missouri, you'd much rather hear from a postdoc in Missouri than from the head of the National Academies, or from me, or from anybody at Harvard. It's much more important to have a local voice, a local scientific voice in those publications. So we've created a service that does that, and it's incredibly highly used. It's called SciLine. We also, on the order of building trust, are building peer-to-peer relationships, because what we found is that we don't have a way of fighting misinformation online. It's too big a problem for any one organization. We can try and create scientists, this next generation of scientists who are digital natives and who are competing in that space for information and influence. But we as an organization cannot. But what we can do is build peer-to-peer relationships with politicians by putting fellows in Congress for a year that build relationships over time. Those relationships last for 40 years, and they serve as really solid rock communication channels particularly in the event of a crisis. You have to build that trust before the crisis happens. We do this with mass media fellows, putting scientists into newsrooms for a time, so they're building relationships with reporters, again, all over the country, not just at the Washington Post and the New York Times. And we do this with seminarians, so faith leaders. We have scientists who are building curriculum in seminaries for future pastors, priests, and rabbis, and are actually including climate change and evolution in curricula in these seminaries. It doesn't mean that we agree on everything, and I can tell you we don't. But it's important to build the relationships of value and respect, because when someone shares your values, it's much easier to then have a conversation with them if they know that we share values. So these types of programs, and we do this in many other influencing fields, is our attempt to try and to work against this mistrust of scientists. The last thing I'll say is that this is not just an American problem. This morning I was speaking to an organization in Denmark talking about these same issues. And so it's not just about the demographics of our country. It's not just about the segmentation of our country. It is about taking a look at ourselves as scientists and biomedical research professionals and realizing that we have to figure out where have we gone wrong. And you're going to hit it. I know about that from Dr. Quinn here in a moment. Where have we had challenges? Where are we not being clear? And really holding up that mirror to ourselves. When I look at the professions from which I speak, I can see that change is possible. Here's why I know that change is possible. The AAAS was founded in 1848 in Philadelphia. It was founded, there's a lovely picture of our founding fathers, they're all fathers, and getting together in Philly. And over the course of the last 173 years, William Redfield, the first president of the AAAS, he would not recognize that I am the CEO of his organization. He wouldn't have imagined that was going to be possible. He also wouldn't have imagined it to be possible that the entire elected leadership of the AAAS right now is women. It's the entire presidential line, the entire elected board is women scientists, and of the highest caliber. He wouldn't have imagined that. So these changes are possible. And what that leads to when the messenger is of and by and for those communities is a much better relationship and a much better communication channel than it ever can be when we are not of our own communities. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to this conversation.
Fantastic, thanks, Sudhir. It was great. Now we'll turn it over to Sandra.
Well, good afternoon. These are two hard acts to follow, but I think you're going to hear some themes. So what I'm going to talk about today is really how a little bit about the historical distrust, but also how do we move toward trust and trustworthiness of our healthcare and scientific institutions. And we know that there has been a long history of particularly in racial and ethnic minority communities, of research that has taken place. And quite honestly, what we hear from community members is nothing changes. They're still suffering from health disparities. They're still having other issues. They often talk about drive-by research. So the researcher that says, I want to do X study here in your community, and that's once the study's over, they never know what's happened. They never get any feedback. They never hear from that person again. But also sometimes research studies have actually contributed to stigma and harm. The Havasupai case is one that says we can actually harm communities unintentionally. The more recent issue of misinformation, disinformation, the active undermining of scientific evidence and research, and the politicalization that we've seen in these past several years. And I agree with Carrie, we started seeing it in some of our research, before the pandemic even. All those things have contributed to kind of the perfect storm. For Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, they can document their history of experiences with research abuses. We all know Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee syphilis study, forced sterilization, all of those things. But some of those might lose some of their power if they weren't being reflected in current and contemporary experiences with bias in healthcare systems and with racism in society. Next. So what I want to do is actually talk about, in the context of the pandemic, what are some of the things that we have done to begin to address the misinformation, to build trust and trustworthiness. And some of these are sort of core principles. And, and I appreciate the discussion of learning healthcare systems and research systems as learning systems, because I do think much of it is on us to learn. So when we look at communities and the engagement of communities in research, the evidence on the value of community engagement is well documented at this point. So, and it can take lots of forms: community-based participatory research, community advisory boards, doing service activities out in communities, bringing high school students in as interns in our labs. There are lots of different ways things may work. But what I think, what I'll share with you is what we've done at our Center for Health Equity during the pandemic. We started our first virtual webinars and town halls. I think the first one I did was last March. And we always brought together community members, community leaders, healthcare providers, policymakers, scientists, to literally answer the questions. The importance of understanding or responding to, the confusion of changing guidance. Why does it change so much? We've talked about that. We answered many of the questions, that people had. Hit next, please, Allison. People had, were there Black scientists involved in the vaccine process? Were there people that look like me, Black, Brown, Indigenous, American Indian, involved in the trials themselves? Why did it go so quickly? What did that mean? How did that happen? And we literally would get into the discussion of all of those things repeatedly and help people understand uncertainty, is really, the nature of a pandemic. There's great uncertainty and science will change. Next, please. What I also want to talk about is we often, there was in the literature, there used to be this phrase that many of us cringed at, and that was hard to reach audiences. And certainly, many people still use that phrase. What we have defined it as, the challenge is not the audience, the challenge is our ability to reach them, and whether that's to recruit into research or to have them come in and take COVID vaccine. And so what we saw in the pandemic was really the creation of very interesting kinds of approaches. And we've used these in many of our forums. Community Immunity is a series of hip hop videos about science and about the pandemic and about the vaccine. Deals with the issue of Tuskegee, deals with the question of were there Black scientists involved in the studies. It deals with some of the, why it's important. Why is this research and getting this vaccine important? So I think as we talk, we need to explore every avenue for a dialogue in communication to help to build knowledge, but also to help to build trustworthiness on our part. Next, please. One of the things that has been a hallmark, there we go. One of the things that's been a hallmark of our work is our work with Black barbershops. And many of them, particularly in Washington, D.C. area, also serve Spanish-speaking populations. So we began working in a number of shops in 2011. Over that time, our barbers and stylists have been trained in colorectal screening and how to talk to their clients about it. And if you've been in a Black barbershop, Fred Spry here on the right, for example, cut the grandfather's hair. He may have cut the father's hair. He may be cutting, the toddler's hair. So it's often generations, long relationships. So we've been working throughout these years in a number of ways, including research in the shops. So what we did in the pandemic was we had Don Milton, who has been much in the news for airborne transmission research around COVID, partnered with us. We're all in the same school. He provided saliva tests for the barbers who have to work. They can't stay home. They have to be out in the workplace. It helped ensure they felt safer and more secure. It provided data for Don, but it also meant that it was an educational opportunity for people who said, what are you doing when they were doing their testing? We picked them up, took them back to the lab. And so it was an opportunity to both educate about science and research, help provide a service in many ways for our barbers and stylists, and helped on with ongoing data collection. Next, please. One of the things we've heard from the very beginning, I mean, years ago, was the need to build trust and build relationships with hospital systems, healthcare systems. And we've been talking in our shops with people about the COVID vaccine since last spring, long before it was ready. One of the things that has changed in our experience is that our big hospital systems in our county have been knocking on our doors saying, how do we get out to a community? They're right now interested in providing services and vaccine services. So we've done a number of clinics, and I will tell you, they're critical. They're reaching people that are not going to walk in someplace else and get the vaccine. But a couple of other things have happened as a result of this. Number one is people are getting vaccinated. Number two, people are not always sure they do trust it yet, but they're going to do it for their loved ones. But the last thing is the healthcare systems have been saying to us, wow, when we take out our mobile vans, nobody comes. We're learning a lot about how to do this. Can we do this again? But what they're also building is trust. So that when one of these systems wants to work with us on doing a research study in a hospital, in a barbershop or in some of our community partners, they have now built a foundation. Next. Most critically important is the power of the legacy of Tuskegee. And it is often, sort of the metaphor for all the other issues that, that people have experienced. What has happened in the context of the pandemic is that the descendants of Tuskegee, have really united and said, we cannot allow what our forefathers experienced be a reason for people not to get vaccinated. And they have been very active in creating videos and PSAs advocating for trust the science, trust the human subjects protections, and get vaccinated. So we still have a long way to go. This is very sort of simple overview, but I do believe that we have learned some lessons in the pandemic that can help us begin to build trustworthiness and trust. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra. We'll start the discussions now. And again, please send in questions if you have any. We have a few more minutes before the top of the hour. I'll start with a question for Carrie. Actually, a comment and then a question. Carrie, I was surprised to see the level of distrust before COVID on your June 16 graph. The effect of COVID seemed to be less impactful on generating more distrust than I would have thought. What did you think?
Yes, I think the issue there is, and this is, I don't know, it's always a bit confusing. Look, so you give people 4 choices. I pay a lot of attention to the share that has that strongest level of trust, because a lot of people fall into that soft trust. So they're not really negative. They can move either way, right? Which means that how we conduct ourselves makes a big difference as well, right? But you do have some that kind of have a stronger immediate reaction. And it has been smaller, but it actually has been growing over time. Right? It's just that it's been growing unevenly between Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, yeah. And then there was a question from the members of the audience about differentials between the doctors and researchers. And maybe you can just tell us what the difference is and how they were distinguished.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it was a complicated study. So like all these things, we're just giving you a little highlight. We had people were asked about one kind of profession or the other. And they had just a one sentence definition for each of those groups. And we also just related to that. I think the part of the question is, how much do people know about medical researchers? Most survey questions are kind of relying on, well, you're going to bring what you can to it. So, but that's why we had just a little bit of definition so that people had some kind of foundation, and we asked people, how much do they know about it? People who said they knew more about what each of those groups did, that did tend to also correlate with more positive views. And we saw that across 6 different groups at the end. We were looking at other kinds of science groups as well. So that hopefully answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. And Rich, I don't know if you have any questions or anybody else on the panel. In the meantime, before that, Sudip, I was fascinated by the difference of distrust between the physical sciences and the health sciences. And do you think that might be because the audiences are different there, or?
I think it's because it's not weighing in a personal decision, and so by the time you see material science in your hands, it's in a sleek phone that you don't care how it works on the inside. And you don't want to have a debate about what the innards look like and what whether or not the chips are quantum chips or analog chips. You don't care. Whereas with health and biomedicine, this is very personal. It's directly affecting you and your family, and it's made it to where as people feel like they can do research online that is just as good as the research that we do as scientists, it's made it to where there are just huge differences in the way they view themselves in the act of biomedical research versus themselves in physical research, physical sciences.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But can I just underscore that point? I mean, I think it's a really useful point to keep in mind that, science writ large has trouble in some fields because people have trouble connecting what those scientists do to their lives. No problem of that sort in biomedical sciences, right? In fact, most people are actually thinking about the biomedical sciences when they think about what is science and how does it affect society. That's the first thing they go to. And it's a very different way to think about everything that scientists do.
So I have a question, and it's something I think we'll come back to throughout the afternoon. Harry talked about a cleavage that was largely, in large measure, driven by political affiliation, and that seems orthogonal to Sandro's lens that looks at parts of the population that have historically been disadvantaged. And are they just 2 separate streams that we should think about, or is there a way to integrate those perspectives?
That's actually a really important question, because I think there are different drivers in many ways of those 2, sort of the historically marginalized racial and ethnic minorities, and the more Republican group that I think whose attitudes towards science have shifted a lot in the last couple of years. So I think it's interesting. We just finished a national study, an ethnographic study, looking at Latino and Black communities and COVID vaccine. And our discussion was, now we need to do it with white Republicans, more rural populations, to understand how to address vaccination and increase vaccination response. So I think they're different drivers, but they're both critically important to address. And, you know, I think we're going to be struggling with that for some time to come. Carrie probably has thoughts too.
I was going to leave it at that, as well said. So no, I think certainly in terms of vaccine hesitancy, there's always been kind of multiple reasons and groups who have different concerns. But the bigger picture that you're raising is I don't see them as conflicting. It's just they are different streams, and we need to pay attention to both things.
The one thing I'd chime in here on is that, you know, those AAAS fellows I told you about that we put in Congress, this year we have a AAAS fellow in Senator Cotton's office. And Senator Cotton has been, you know, he's challenging on climate crisis. There's some places where we just don't agree. And yet he asked for a AAAS S&T policy fellow because there's a vast amount of things where there is agreement, and building that little level of trust so that if he knows that person over the course of the year, can we have another conversation about vaccines or about climate is one way forward. But that's bits and pieces. That's one person at a time. It's not scalable.
That's a good point. So were there any examples or segments in biomedical research where there was high trust, and are there ways that we can figure out how to amplify that component?
Well, it's interesting, you know, there are, if you look at trust in biomedicine and who trusts biomedicine, and then you look at who trusts agriculture research related to GMOs, you know, you're likely to get a very different answer from the same people. And it's, I'm always fascinated by, there is a lens that we put on all of this, which is our own personal background. So in biomedical research, people love the idea of precision medicine, of gene editing to cure disease, right? I'm fascinated by this. We're talking about changing people's DNA. And with sickle cell anemia, people are excited to bring it on. And thank goodness they are, because you know it looks like a real possibility. So again, the lens, the personal lens is we think we do a lot more sociological research, a lot more social sciences to really understand how these technologies are impacting our population, because we're hitting them with everything. We're doing advances in gene editing. We're giving them a metaverse. We're giving them, you know, the complete way that we live our lives is changing over the last 20 years in a way that it hasn't changed probably in centuries. And I don't know that we know enough about what this is doing to us as humanity. The social sciences are going to be really important here.
That's a really good point. I don't know if we pay as much attention to the social sciences as we should in this. You're right. Well, I think we've reached the top of the hour. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Rich for the next session. Thanks so much to all the presenters. That was a fantastic discussion and presentation.
Yeah, it surely was. Right. So there are some people doing this, and there's a something that we can all use to float some applause by. So we're going to continue the theme here, and our goal is to focus a bit more on what's happening most recently and how the pandemic and our response to it has made a difference. But this is a continuum. We have so the structure of this session is 2 presenters and 2 reactors, and then open discussion for everyone. So once again, I encourage everyone who's participating in this webinar to weigh in through the Q&A. Our first presenter will be Ramona Burrs, who's Associate for Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Trials at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, and Lisa Fitzpatrick, who's the founder and CEO of Grapevine Health, will follow her. So Ramona, please take the virtual podium.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. It's an extreme pleasure to be here to be engaged in this conversation around doing better with research and making sure that it's more diverse and inclusive. If we can go to the next slide, please. And skip this one, go to the next one. Again, super excited to share this platform with both Dr. Fitzpatrick and Gwen, because it really truly takes a collaborative approach to change the narrative on research in underrepresented communities. Since 2019, my team has been working to ensure that our clinical trials are more diverse in nature and that they're equitable and inclusive. And with that, that was an entirely huge focus for our Ensemble phase 3 COVID vaccine trial. We believe that in order to achieve health equity, that therapies that we come up with and vaccines that we develop, they have to be accessible to all patients. And so building on this legacy of purpose-driven actions and commitment to diversity, we wanted to ensure that this Ensemble trial was very much so reflective of the disproportionate impact that we saw when it came to the pandemic. So I'm excited to report the results from this trial included, from a global perspective, over 34% of participants who were over the age of 60, and over 45% of global participants who identified as women or a female gender. If we look specifically in the US, again, excited to report that we had 15% representation of folks who identified as Hispanic or Latinx, and 13% who identified as Black African American. And those statistics are specific to the US. Now, in order to get to those numbers, we realized that, again, that collaborative approach was definitely needed. We needed to focus on easing barriers to access to kind of help increase the enrollment with those underrepresented and underserved populations. And so we took some lessons learned from our prior trial work, because again, we started our team focusing on diversity before COVID came about, and so what we did, took the lessons from what we experienced in other trials, but pulled them into COVID, and again, reached into our networks to really have that collaborative effort. So whether it was partnering with community-based organizations or health professional organizations, but using them as tools to go out into communities and start a campaign around why education is important when we talk about understanding clinical trials and the nuances and the need for diversity in that space. We can go to the next slide, please. So taking some of the successes of tactics that were used with Ensemble, we now have this equation for what does good look like, so we can have this reflected across our entire portfolio. So we know that strategy is important, operational excellence, community engagement are all key components that are important to having our clinical trials be diverse and reflective of the patient population or who's going to be the end user of the product. So we want our clinical trials to represent not only the disease prevalence that we see in communities, but also approach and attack some of the disparities that may also be present in some of those spaces. So with strategy, it's important that we implement diversity from point one of our clinical trial design. That means, again, understanding the epidemiology data, and then two, looking at the disparity data. It's going to be nuances when we look at it from a US perspective and also from a global perspective, but having those insights to ensure that from day one, we are operationalizing our clinical trials so that access is available to folks, and we also have inclusive and diverse participation in the research. Operational excellence is a key component as well too, because it's not enough to have a strategy on paper, but how do we take it and actually put it into play? So what we're doing here is we're really focusing on ensuring that we have sites that are able to support diverse recruitment efforts. If there's a need for a cultural competency training for some of the site members, research members at the site, we conduct that. We use our clinical trial educators to build that competency. So in case there are uncomfortable or difficult conversations that need to be had to engage diverse patients at that site, we equipped our clinicians and our researchers to be able to have those conversations. But also too, leveraging innovation and technology, to Sudeep's point. How can we, again, use some of the emerging technology that we have to reach communities that may not be close to a clinical research site? Again, looking at our success with Ensemble, we leverage a decentralized platform for clinical trials to reach some of the participants in that space. And so we're continuing, again, to take the lessons learned there and apply it across our entire portfolio. But none of this is successful without that community engagement. So again, collaboration, whether it's a health professional organization, a community-based org, patient advocacy org, those are the community trust folks, right? They have the trust of the community. So how do we partner with them to, again, spread education and awareness around why research is important, not only to learn more about the drugs themselves that are under research, but also to learn more about the disparities or how diseases manifest differently across different groups. So again, these are three key components that we are really looking at, again, to get success across our entire portfolio, but building off of the success of our COVID-19 phase 3 study. Next slide. So I'm happy to say that we have a community campaign, Research Includes Me. We actively engage a group of patients to say, hey, what is it that you want to know about clinical trials? What does that look like? How do you want that information presented to you? Who would you like to present it to you? We took all of those collective insights and we created this campaign. It's a minimally branded campaign, so you don't see Janssen splashed around everywhere, but it's one that we use as a tool when we go out into communities to talk about, again, what are clinical trials? Because we know that there's a need to kind of balance the misinformation that's out there about clinical trials, but also to address some of the historical ills that we know are present and are top of mind for many people, but to give them an update as to how research is conducted in present day, to let them know that their rights are protected, to let them know that safety is being measured throughout their participation if they were to participate in a clinical trial. So Research Includes Me. It's equipped with a website. We equip it with brochures, pamphlets. We have a mobile unit that goes around to different communities. Again, to just talk about general clinical trial information. So to answer questions, what is a phase 1 versus a phase 4? Those questions that communities have, again, so that we can engage them and empower them with the education that's going to support them to make positive health decisions. So again, super excited to have these avenues, again, taking some of the lessons learned from our COVID-19 clinical trial, but also implementing it across our entire portfolio. And again, thank you for this discussion today. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Ramona. That was terrific. Lisa, do you want to pick it up now, please? You are muted.
I can't tell you how many times I've had to hear that. You're on mute. It's nice to be here with you, and thank you for including me in this conversation. Unfortunately, I can't be here for the later Q&A session, so I plan to use a couple of my minutes to offer some thoughts about how we can move forward to improve diversity in trials and also trust in trials. But I wanted to spend my time talking about what we've learned on the ground. So I'm very glad to follow Ramona, because some of the learnings that she just talked about, we saw those in action during the pandemic, helping people understand how clinical trials work, improving trust in the vaccine, and so on. So the first lesson I want to highlight with a story about why I joined the clinical trial. So I was a Moderna clinical trial participant, and it hadn't occurred to me to sign up for the trial until we were doing outreach in Washington, D.C. And I asked the gentleman if he was interested in getting the vaccine when it became available. And he said, well, no, I don't want to have anything to do with Trump's vaccine. And also, I don't trust that. And I said, well, what would it take to get you to take the vaccine? He said, if I could see other Black people associated with it, then I would probably do it. And I asked this question among other groups as well, including a group of seniors I worked with throughout the pandemic. And they expressed the same concerns. They wanted to see that Black people were enrolled in the trials and also part of the research teams. So I used my clinical trial experience as an opportunity to educate people. So we created some videos, posted them on social media, but also used them in some of our group sessions, or when we're out in the community talking about why people should consider taking the COVID-19 vaccine. The second one is related to, and I'm sorry I've missed the other conversation, so I apologize if this has already been discussed, but I think providers have a critical role to play in increasing diversity and also ensuring we have adequate participation in trials. And this came to my attention because we also have been conducting Ask the Doctor sessions during the pandemic. And in one of these sessions, a gentleman said to me, I've been with my doctor for almost 20 years, and he told me not to get vaccinated. Why should I believe you when I've had a relationship with him for such a long time and I trust him? So this gave me pause, and I followed up with the gentleman who asked the question and asked a bit more about his doctor. And his doctor was a primary care provider who had never worked for an academic health center and had never participated in the clinical trial or the research process, had never enrolled any of his patients in clinical trials. And it helped me understand the disconnect, because I think the public, this is the first time the public is really paying attention to science and research, and we should be excited about that. But at the same time, we're throwing a lot of information at the public and expecting them to synthesize it when they're getting so much information from so many different places, and a lot of it is inaccurate, as I'm sure you've talked about today. So I think one of the areas we really need to focus on as we try to improve trust and diversity in trials and research is to ensure our frontline health providers are prepared to participate. I think helping them understand what it means for them to participate, addressing their concerns. I've done some work on this in the past, and primary care providers have told me, well, I would consider that, but I heard you won't get your patients back. And that might be true, but how do we work with primary care providers in such a way that we address their concerns so they become a willing partner in this? And then the third thing I learned is that the messenger matters, particularly for something like this that is so critical. I know you've talked about trust. I saw one of the earlier speakers showing how they've been out in the community and trusted places talking about the vaccine and getting people vaccinated. We continue to see this as a critical element. And I think sometimes we're dismissive about matching the messenger and believing just because someone is a doctor, for instance, anyone can give the information. But the truth is, people want to hear from people who look like them or share their background or understand their experiences and their life journey. And so in thinking about how to move forward, in addition to the suggestions I've already made about the provider education and matching the messenger, I think prioritizing community education and helping them connect the dots between clinical trials and the medications they take, whether over the counter or not, really helping people practically understand what research is, how it has saved lives and what it means for them. I think we take these things for granted. And finally, I think we have to slow down the process if we really want to build trust in communities and diversify trials. I know it's unpopular. I know there are time pressures when it comes to research, but you can't build trust overnight. You've probably heard that already today. But if we want Black and Brown communities, particularly underserved communities, to trust us and engage in research with us, we have to take the time needed to build trust, which means we might have to slow down the process. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions.
Okay, Lisa, that was so helpful. Before we get to questions, we have two reactors. The first is Gwen Darien, whom you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Gwen is the Executive Vice President for Patient Advocacy and Engagement at the National Patient Advocate Foundation. And Joe Ross is a professor of general medicine and public health at the Yale School of Medicine. He also co-directs the YODA project, which is a very important initiative to open science more transparent. So Gwen, let's start with you for your thoughts about the comments we've heard and other issues related to this topic.
Great, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And as I have more thoughts than we can get in a 3-minute reaction, but I just want to think about, I want to reframe this and recenter this a little bit, because I think that we're jumping over a number of steps as we talk about how we can build trust. And we've gotten too far down the pathway of things that we can do without looking at the root causes of why there is this mistrust, and how we also, I mean, I think the COVID epidemic was a pandemic, our ongoing pandemic is a perfect example of how we sort of started from a position that was something that we've always done. So, you know, when Lisa said, "Oh, you're on mute," that's something I've heard for throughout this time that we've been on Zoom meetings. It's something that happens with me as well. But what we've done is that we have to take people off mute who we've put on mute since the beginning of time. And that's why we need to, since the beginning of our country, that's why we need to center and recenter this on equity and center it on the experiences and the voices of people who have been historically marginalized in this, every aspect of our society, and have incredibly inequitable health outcomes. So I would say that one of the things that I would say is that we keep on talking about trust as a way to build trustworthiness, but we have to flip that. We have to build trustworthiness in order to develop trust. We're not going to have trustworthiness unless we have organizations, institutions, and people who are trustworthy. So trustworthiness comes before trust. One of the things that I found really, I would say, really disturbing in the beginning of the pandemic, and as we talked about people's choices not to get vaccinated, so much the focus was on Black, Indigenous, people of color, and their choices not to take the vaccine. And we really have to change that and focus not just on choices people make, but choices people have. And it was very late in this conversation that we actually started talking about the kind of political and social beliefs that were informing people's choices not to take it. And we heard in earlier presentations how much people's political views, particularly political views that were Republican leaning, cause them not to take the virus. So we focused from the beginning in the way that we've always framed it, which is the choices that people who are Black, Brown, Indigenous make, not on the choices that they have. We also started, it was brought up earlier, that we have to go to communities and listen and listen and listen, not just and understand before we can make change. I also think that we have to change the order quite a bit in what we're talking about. And Ramona, I would actually challenge that we start with community engagement first, and then go to strategy, and then go to operationalizing excellence, because we have to start with community if we really want to build a culture of diversity and an ethos of diversity. So I would say, so I said this earlier in an earlier National Academies meeting that I was co-chairing on promoting health equity. But one of the things, when I started as an advocate, one of the things I wanted more than anything was just to have a seat at the table. And now that I've been doing advocacy for almost 25 years, I'm a 3-time cancer survivor. I want to build the table. I don't want to have a seat at a table that somebody else has built. And I think that's the way that we're really that's one of the primary ways we're going to change how we achieve equitable outcomes in healthcare for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joe, you're our final designated speaker, and then we'll launch into a discussion that involves everybody.
Thanks, Rich. I'm really honored to be here. I mean, I'm almost at a loss for how I can best contribute to this conversation, because these issues of engaging communities, stakeholder engagement around trial participation, all of them are so critical as part of fostering research and clinical trial participation. And the points that Gwen is making around fostering that trust, building that trust, ensuring access, not just equitable participation, are also critical. I think I'll take this around from the other side of things, around in terms of my role leading or co-leading the YODA project. The Yale Open Data Access Project has, for the better part of the decade now, fostered access to clinical trial data that's been completed by companies, principally Johnson & Johnson, to other external investigators for use. And there are actually remarkable quantities of clinical trial data that are generated through research, never published, never disseminated, and even when they are so, are disseminated in very limited means. And that in itself actually generally affects trust in the overall clinical research enterprise. When people participate in research, they volunteer because they believe their contributions are going to be used for science and to improve medicine and public health. And when the data from those trials aren't disseminated to the broader scientific community, when those data aren't made more widely available to other investigators to use for their own research, that inhibits trust in the overall research enterprise. So, in the spirit of trying to promote transparency, promote independence, promote innovation in science, the YODA project was set up as an organization to act as almost like a third-party intermediary between the large sponsors of research, principally companies, and outside investigators who have their own scientific questions they want to ask and use those data to answer. That's the sort of the role that we played, and we believe patients want their data to be shared from clinical trials. They want more people to be able to ask those questions and to learn, so long as there's a good stewardship of the data and the data are handled responsibly. And I think this is one way to sort of foster greater trust in the overall research enterprise. Anyways, thanks for inviting me to participate, and I'm happy to answer questions. It's not as specific to the engagement around COVID-19 because we don't have a lot of data out there yet for the COVID-19 treatments and vaccines, but soon we hope.
Okay, great. So we have close to 20 minutes, and we have good questions and comments from the audience. Let's start with those, and then work our way through to other things that are of interest. One of the in the spirit of identifying the trusted messengers, one of the questions is where do nurses and advanced practice nurses fit in the galaxy of people who are trustworthy and have earned trust?
Yeah, this goes to Dr. Fitzpatrick's point about using clinicians as that voice of research, because I think we forget that intimate relationship that we have between provider and patient. And as we have so many now advanced practice providers, actively treating patients from a primary care perspective, they cannot be excluded from the equation. So one of the partnerships that we have here at Johnson & Johnson that I'm super excited for is with National Medical Fellowship, where we've sponsored a program with Merck actually to devise clinical trials training program for physicians, but also for those advanced practice providers, for pharmacists, to learn what does good clinical trial operations look like, so they get a more intimate understanding of, again, the process and the rights that their patients have and the safety component. And so once they matriculate through this program, they can be used either for that referral source, or if they want to, they can be part of the investigator pool that we leverage between both companies. And we're hoping to broaden this program. But that's the role that I see. They definitely need to be that voice of subject matter expertise, but we also need to leverage that intimate relationship they have with their patients to start these conversations.
Does anyone else want to speak to this question?
I just want to say thank you for creating a program like that. I think it's essential that the folks in the pipeline learn about these issues, because they're going to be the researchers, of the next decade or two, and we need them to understand how important it is for them to help us with this problem.
John Birch observes that patients are often both surprised and disappointed that their own data is not routinely used to generate new knowledge, and that's been an ongoing an ongoing concern of this collaborative. And I'm interested in your thoughts about the extent to which that phenomenon is playing a role in this issue of lack of trust, particularly around the.
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think that's a really, really important point, and it goes back to all of the points about designing for sustainability and relationships with community and relationships with patients, and that's because when you participate in a clinical trial and when you are in that relationship, there's a moral compact between all the participant and the researcher, and part of the moral compact of the researcher is to research questions that matter to patients, tell them what is being used to, and return those results. So if we're just participating in research, but it doesn't seem to answer a question that is important to patients and really accrues to patient benefit, then I think that it does lead to mistrust, and it does lead to broken trust. And a while ago, a number of organizations, and they're still in response to this, and particularly in response to biobanks, a number of patient organizations started their own biobanks so that they could help determine what would happen and give access to researchers and clinicians for biobanks for specific diseases.
Mhm. From a sponsor perspective, may I add too that we're also changing that. So when we go back to that slide where I had the equation, that's part of the operations. We're really empowering our investigators to have the results so they can go back with the participants and communicate, whether they were in, the active arm or the study drug arm. But I think that piece is important. And Gwen, I wanted to go back to and reference something that you mentioned about the community engagement. That's the beauty of the Research Includes Me program, because it's agnostic of any therapeutic area, it's agnostic of any drug. That's a mainstay in the community. So we don't have that transactional relationship. So I'm not just going into the community, for the needs of a particular study or research program. But that's kind of the responsibility that we're taking from a sponsor perspective.
That's great. And can I just add one more thing? Because I think it was talked about a little bit earlier, which is that and it's been brought up, it's sort of been an implicit thing that we've talked about, but there's particularly in the first panel, there is very low science and health literacy among the general public. And so there's real tension between, and as we saw in if you look at the statistics that were presented both by Carrie and by Sandra, they both focused on how many people felt positively about certain things, but the negative percentage of people who didn't trust a learning health system and a learning science system was really high. So people don't understand. They expect that science is going to give them an answer that is definitive, rather than valuing the learning system. And so we focus very much, and I would include myself in that as well, on a learning system without remembering that we have to communicate that very clearly and on an ongoing basis to people and to the public.
But Gwen, if I could just respond to that and say, I think largely the academic and research institutions writ large are pretty paternalistic about this. We say, well, this is too complicated, like people can't understand it. And so we use that as an excuse not to include the community in these conversations when actually they're intelligent, they want to know. So we have to make the effort to bring them along with us.
Yeah, and when people are yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. As a patient advocate and a patient, it just raises the back of the hair on the back of my neck raises when people say, "Well, patients won't understand this."
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
you have to speak in their language.
So we have a question from Jeremy Green, and rather than my reading it, Jeremy, can you unmute and speak for yourself?
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much to all the panelists. I've really been enjoying the discussion this far. And my question really builds on both panels. But I think that the first panel, I really appreciated the move from trust to trustworthiness. Like, how do we go from trust to something people either have or do not have, like literacy, to trustworthiness is something that needs to be earned, or as you're just saying, how does literacy become something that can be built? But my question here is the examples I'm hearing, and also in the title of the book that Sandra passed along, Building Trust Between Minorities and Researchers, considers these as two different categories, right? And so the first was on trusted intermediators for communicating between researchers and minorities. And then in this panel, we've had very interesting discussion about how a broad diversity of humankinds can be included in as research subjects, right, as material or as data for research. But part of this trustworthiness is feeling that one is included in institutions of science. One has access to becoming a scientist, to taking part in specifying the agenda for scientific research, or from benefiting from that research. And I'd love to hear the panelists in this panel speculate on how that gets roped in as part of moving from trust to trustworthiness, of having institutions of science be things that everyone feels that they are included in as possible members of, and having a say in what it is and who benefits from it.
That's a great question, Jeremy. And I think first we need to stop looking at the issue so narrowly and really look at it from a patient care continuum, and really look at it from a pipeline perspective, to Dr. Fitzpatrick's point earlier. So I know that immediately I don't have enough investigators who are diverse in nature that could amplify some of the efforts that we're prioritizing with recruiting diverse patients, right? But then if I think about what is the percentage of physicians who are African-American, let's say, it's 5%. So I've got a narrow pool. So now I'm gonna go to those college students and I'm gonna stand up programming that's gonna encourage them to move into different health professions, whether it's, to be a medical doctor, to be an RN, what have you. But then it takes time, right? And so I think that's to Gwen's point, like, we can't fix this overnight because we didn't get here overnight. But then also too, how do we take those learnings and this education and take it into the high schools, into the elementary schools? And I see someone had put that question in the chat as well too. So I think it's being really cognizant of where we are, but also taking a look at the bigger picture and where we can make a difference.
This question reminds me of an occasion on the street last year. We were doing outreach and this woman comes up and gives me a banana and she says, "I bought this banana for you." I was very touched by the gesture and I told her I would eat it later. And she said, "I want to watch you eat it." And I said, "Well, we're busy." She said, "But can you eat it right now?" She was insistent. And I said, "Tell me why it's so important to you and I'll take a bite." And she said, "I want to see if you trust us." So we think about trust in very specific ways. So if we're researchers, academicians, clinicians, how do we build trust? We have our ideas about that. But what she was saying to me is, do you see me as an equal? Do you respect me? Like, am I just like you? And so how are we showing up when we talk to communities? Because they can sense whether or not we're being condescending or whether we're being genuine and authentic. And so these are hard things to, we can't create a protocol for being authentic with the community. I think it takes time. Like I said, it takes time and you have to go back over and over, because she also said to me, "When are you coming back?" So it's not a fly in, fly out thing. And so if they don't feel included, it's because we haven't taken the time to help them understand how valuable their voice is and to actively include them in the process. Even though it takes time to do that, we have to figure it out.
Oh, you can't skip over the part of building relationships and building trust. So I'll tell you two perspectives on this. So we did I've been doing a lot of work with friends and colleagues in community health in the Mississippi Delta, and we did a workshop with patients and community members to talk about conversations about cost of care. And at the end, we said to everybody who was in this workshop, there were 12 people. It was a small group. What they got out of the workshop, what were the things, their key takeaways. And one of the women said, you've given us hope. You've given us hope that there are solutions for some of our problems. She said, but I want to see you come back. So we gave hope, but the hope was reserved whether we were actually doing this, we were sustaining this relationship. And it is a challenge I think we have to give to everybody. Are you designing for sustainability? And do you go back? And Ramona and Lisa both talked about that at length. And then the other thing that Lisa talked about, another forum on trust that I was in, another panel, Don Berwick said something that is one of my touchstones when I think about it. He said, trust does not survive inauthenticity. And that's really, I think, much of I think that builds on what Lisa was saying about the trust and her interaction with the community.
Can I also respond to someone's comment in the questions about the language? Because the language can also be very dismissive and off-putting. And so the examples here are human subjects or research subjects when these are people, or they're partners or collaborators. And can we find better language that's more inclusive to make people feel as if they're valued in the process?
Yeah.
There's more going on.
And yes, I ate the banana, sorry.
Yeah.
It was a really good banana.
Yeah. So there's more in the chat and the Q&A than we're going to get to in the next 4 minutes. But we have time later, so I think we'll get to everything. But I would like to use just the next few minutes to hear from all of you about how to balance the need to take time to build trust with the fact that 2,000 people a day are dying of a disease that we desperately need to develop new evidence about. And how do we sort of balance the tension that those two very important carry with them?
I think the immediate issue is the access, right? So having access to innovative technologies and innovative therapies and vaccines and treatments, that's a easy win. But two, thinking about, again, the bigger picture, where can we do better? And again, that's where I go back to our strategies for how we're operationalizing, how we do research, taking that internal look to see where can we do better. Because as was mentioned in the first panel, this is a shared responsibility. So many times we hear conversations and dialogue where there's blame conferred to the patients in a broader community, but it's a shared responsibility. We know the health system itself, there's issues in the health system. If the American Medical Association can say that racism is a public health threat, I think we all need to be very cognizant of the issues that impact different communities and be willing to put in the resources that are needed to kind of correct the problem. But to Gwen's point and Dr. Fitzpatrick's point, using the patient as the voice, right? We can't just come in and say we're going to fix everything, but we really have to understand what are the nuances, because there are so many different dimensions of diversity. I can say, African-American, Latinx, but there are dimensions of diversity within diversity. So whether someone's a woman, whether they're, LGBTQ. So we really need to understand what the issues are, because they are also impacted, regionally too. You see differences, but understand where they are. What are the immediate things that we can do to kind of jump in and change what's going on, but also look at it from a holistic standpoint too.
I think we have to recognize there's a percentage of people, maybe 20% or so, who will never get vaccinated in the case of the pandemic. And we have to focus on the other people who are along this continuum. So where are they? Are they contemplating? Are they looking for a trusted messenger? Or do they need access? That, to me, that's the balance. So don't spend our time and energy trying to convert people when there are so many people who are right there, who need our support, and they need the education so that we can provide the resources they need. You know, the pandemic will be over one way or the other, and we can escalate that, I think, by meeting people, meeting their educational and their support needs.
And I would also say that just because it's not, these are not mutually exclusive. So you can deal with people's immediate health needs and immediate social needs and social risks while you are also working to build sustainability, while you're working to dismantle racism, while you're working to achieve health equity. So you have to work on, I mean, everything we do, we don't all go on one track all the time at one point. There are multiple things going on. So if you think about the way that we exist as human beings, the way we experience life, it is the same thing as the way that we will experience this change. It doesn't have to be either or, it can be and.
Terrific. So Joe, if you have a comment, let's have it.
Well, I was just going to add, I just want to reiterate how important it is that trust has to be earned over time, right? And it's just like, showing back up in the communities, day after day, week after week, and not just dropping in once to start a research study. And then, our healthcare system is oriented in a very specific way, and it treats people in sometimes very negative ways. And so you can't just expect people to trust, even in the context of a pandemic. You have to really reorient the whole system towards providing more kinder care, more accessible care, not being less stigmatized care, if you want people to engage fully and work within the system.
Let's put a semicolon on this, because we have another really important session that needs to start now. So let me thank all four of you for a really stimulating and helpful set of conversations. And I know that you can't all be here for our wrap up, but I'm still looking forward to as much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Rick, you're.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. That was a fantastic session. I just also want to make sure that everybody knows that there were some really great comments and questions in the Q&A that we probably should have another hour in this session alone just to go through some of those. We will summarize those in the summary part. So please use the Q&A to make comments and stuff, and we will collect all of those at the end, even if we can't discuss them in the meeting. So we're going to move on to our next session, entitled Society, Science, and Social Media. And I think this will be pretty exciting, kind of diving into the belly of the beast, I think, to some degree. So this session will share the evolution of the influence of social media, political trends, unique facets of human psychology that cause people to be swayed in different directions of thinking and responding to information shared with them through different messengers. So this is a critical pillar of the problem of distrust, I think, and we all agree with that. This session will emphasize the importance of the communication of science and maybe share how social media can be positive rather than negative in particular, and could be used to educate and counter the spread of misinformation. So I'm really eager to hear about that. So we have some distinguished panelists that will do the presentation. Robin Vanderpool, who's the Chief of the Health Communications and Informatics Research Branch, the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at NCI. Jay Von Bavel, who is Associate Professor of the Psychology and Neuroscience at New York University. Katya Agnia-Nova, who's Associate Professor of Communications at Rutgers University. And Jeremy Green, Professor of History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. So with that, let's start with Robin.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. I'll look forward to, there we are, the slides are up. Thank you again for the opportunity to present. I am just thoroughly enjoying the workshop so far and really appreciate the discussion that's been occurring, and look forward to the remainder of the afternoon. I want to say just a special thanks to my colleague, Dr. Sylvia Cho. Many of you all may know her from the misinformation and social media science and research space, and she helped with preparing these slides and remarks this afternoon. But again, really pleased that NCI could be at the table this afternoon. So I am going to set the stage to think about social media and certainly its impact on health. And as the focus of our workshop this afternoon, the focus on how social media may have contributed to the proliferation of misinformation and also potential distrust. And again, I hope we can brainstorm ideas essentially to get the train back on the tracks. And so I've titled this Two Sides of the Same Coin. And again, look forward to our discussion. So with the next slide, I've been asked really to set the stage and thinking about where we started with social media and then throughout my brief presentation, where we are now. And so as highlighted on this slide, you can certainly recognize many of the benefits to social media, and many of these benefits were particularly salient during the early days of the social media platforms. And I think these benefits can really be summarized into some major categories where we think about the opportunity to communicate with one another in real time and share, right? Communication and information sharing. And you can think all the way back. Do you remember when we used to have, online blogs and support groups, listservs and kind of bulletin boards that were online? Those were some of the early days before we branched out into the myriad platforms that we have now. But looking at these benefits, and we know how these are important to health-related outcomes. We had social support, the ability to have both targeted and tailored information. Social media, in a sense, actually has also presented equitable access to information. It's available to all of us, and the potential even there to decrease the digital divide. It's free. For the most part, it is free for all of us. And you have that real-time outreach and engagement. There are opportunities to promote healthy behaviors. And again, back to social support and peer-to-peer interactions. And then if you think about those of us in the research space, social media opened up a whole new way to do health related research. So you had observational studies where we could simply just analyze the data that's coming out of social media posts. You can look at individuals' knowledge, their attitudes. People are posting about their behaviors all the time. And so you were having this huge amount of surveillance data that's, again, relatively low cost and easy to harvest. And so that's one way to look at that research opportunities on social media, but you also have the opportunity to intervene. So we're so used to doing things in person or in group settings or patient to provider. And social media really opened up, again, another avenue for us to deliver over technology different interventions that could lead to behavior change, that could provide important health information and increase our awareness and knowledge. And again, to recruit people into our studies. So again, these are kind of the lay of the land, maybe where we potentially had some, we had high hopes and maybe we still had our rose-colored glasses on in thinking about social media. Next slide. And if you step back, you can put this all on a timeline. And what I've done for you in this slide is actually to show you the evolution of social media platforms and how they onboarded over the years, as well as how we started thinking about social media related research, and particularly as it relates to health. And so as again, the platforms came online, research was actually pretty descriptive. We first needed to know, who's going on the internet, who's accessing social media, what are their characteristics and profiles, and are they using social media for health? And at the time, NCI and NIH and other agencies actually also started asking for intervention research and grant applications. And in 2013, we had one of our first funding announcements related to social media and substance use and addiction. And we got over 100 applications to that RFA to focus on intervention research using social media. But again, as we have moved, and you can see again the shift over time, particularly as we started to see some of the negative aspects of social media present themselves. The Cambridge Analytica, if you will, scandal from a few years back really highlighted that information coming out of social media is being used by third parties, by other countries, by other political campaigns, by other bad actors to tailor and target information and misinformation and even disinformation toward the public. And then we've had to shift. We're always, it seems like, being reactive, where now we're trying to really get a grasp of, again, what is misinformation? How is it presenting itself? It was the word of the year in 2018 on dictionary.com. And then we start seeing things like vaccine hesitancy, which, as we all know on this workshop, has been heavily influenced by the anti-vaccination community and advocacy and work that's done online. Seeing that emerge as a global public health problem. And then the pandemic of COVID-19 hit along. Now also you may be seeing the phrasing around misinfodemic, where we have this parallel health crisis and an information crisis of seeing, again, misinformation. We're seeing racism and xenophobia online. And again, trying to react to understanding what will work to curb this public health crisis. And again, what's driving this public health crisis around misinformation. And then, you can update this timeline in real time, because just over the past couple of weeks, we added the Facebook whistleblower and the data that's coming out of that from the various platforms. So again, I think you can outline, this just gives a sense of where we started and where we are now, knowing that it's changing almost every day, to say the least. And so with the next slide, we now have to, again, take off our rose-colored glasses, I would argue, and also consider the risk of social media. And these range everything from cyber aggression to the misinformation silos and echo chambers. The low cost and the rapid spread can actually be a negative piece because of the way that misinformation can spread, the lack of gatekeeping and the content that's out there. And then for another talk, another day, we can also talk about the ethics of online research. And even when there is content moderation by some of the platforms, how that can impact some of our positive health-related messages. Next slide. And so what we've coined here is this perfect storm of where you have falsehoods that spread faster than truth and faster than credible science. And the notion of again these platforms being the venue and the mechanisms for this fast and wide dissemination of information. And I think what we're here to talk about again today is this growing mistrust and how misinformation plays into that and can really impact our emotions and our fear and play into different ideologies and different identities. Next slide. And so really quickly, we're back to thinking about online misinformation. We're a little bit like we were in the early days of social media, and just trying to understand where it is, how much of it's out there, the prevalence of it, the quality of the information. And I've just quickly put up examples from breast cancer, where we're seeing it occur on things like Pinterest, prostate cancer. And we have to realize there's video and visual content on social media and how that shows up on YouTube as an example. And just recently we had another study, or the community had a study published in JNCI that talks about cancer articles containing misinformation and harmful information, and that those pieces of information garner greater engagement on social media. Next slide. And I will not repeat all of this that you see on this next slide around COVID misinformation. We're all living it. We see it every single day. But misinformation is circulating rampantly and wildly on social media, all the way from disease characteristics to the vaccines. We also know unproven treatments have popped up, the spread of the virus and the origins and policy responses as well. And so with the next slide, what I want to just quickly articulate is it's more about the prevalence and quality of the information. We've got to understand what the sources of the misinformation are and what are the motivations behind that and the nuances to all of this, right? It's not just text. It's video, it's images, it's visual, component to it, and an audio component. We also need to understand repeated exposure. How many times does someone log in on Facebook or Instagram on a daily basis? What do we mean by engagement? Is it a simple like or a simple share? or are you internalizing that information? And then I think some of my colleagues today are really going to get into some of the individual characteristics and the psychology around what makes some of us even more susceptible to misinformation. And we have to consider social media. We're using it broadly in one phrase, but it is many different platforms in many different languages and many different, again, audio, visual, and text-based information. And how does that play out? And so with the next slide, I just want to hone in and just say, why should we care about all of this? And again, I think that's why we're here today. There can be some significant health impacts, health-related impact on disease survival, on financial implications, on psychosocial implications, on trust with the provider, which again, we've spoken about today, and exacerbation of health disparities. And this is another piece of how does exposure really play out in negative health outcomes. And I think we have seen this over and over again in the pandemic, but I also think it plays out every day around cancer, diabetes, every other health condition that we have as well. And I think that's an important perspective to have. All right, and I'm going to wrap up here with two last slides. The next one is for us to consider, and we can certainly dive into this during the solution and strategy session, but you all may have recently seen the Office of Surgeon General and another National Academy report on identifying credible sources of health information, but really thinking about how we as an entire society can approach misinformation and social media and this environment around disinformation, misinformation, and building trust again. And we can get, and I think we've already had some conversations around this, again, how we can, the individual person all the way up through the government, the technologies, journalists, and healthcare providers. And so I want to conclude with a last slide that I do think, again, let's recall there are positive aspects of social media. And even more recently, I know that we have seen, for example, social media being used to condemn and counteract racist rhetoric and supporting our minority communities. We've also seen social media that really empowered and leveraged for social mobilization and social justice issues, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we can also remember that there are people and places and organizations who still want to have a positive impact on social media and want to have a healthy discourse, for example, around vaccination. And that, it takes a lot of work and effort and content moderation, but it can be done to promote a healthy debate in health and to maintain social media for all the good reasons that we remember that when it first was launched and the research that we're able to do on those platforms. And so with that, I'll stop and turn it over to our next speakers.
Thanks, Robin. And thank goodness for your last slide, because there's hopefully something good about social media. With that, let's turn over to Jay.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me today. It was a great talk. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about polarization and misinformation and how they are interacting together during the pandemic. Go to the next slide. And I want to say, if you want a bit of background on this, this is a paper I put together with about 40 other colleagues across the social and behavioral sciences. In the earliest days of the pandemic, I think we wrote it in March. I'm in New York City, right before we got shut down and went into lockdown. We started putting it together. And what we tried to do is summarize as much as we knew in the literature about what were going to be the major issues that society was going to face, not just in the US, but abroad, and especially how this might play out during the pandemic. So we did our best to summarize all the research that we thought would be relevant on key topics. Go to the next slide. And here's a brief map of some of the topics that we covered. But today I'm going to focus more in the bottom left-hand corner on the role of science communication, and especially on the spread of conspiracy theories and fake news and why those spread and what might be done to stop them, and how that happens in a social context. So these things don't happen in vacuums, and they happen differently in different nations with different social and political contexts. And so obviously the previous panel talked a lot about things like racism, social inequality. Obviously culture matters a great deal as you look across countries. And in the US, one of the big ones has been political polarization. And so I'm going to talk to you about how those provide the context in which misinformation spreads. Next slide. The context in which we're operating here in the United States is one of extreme polarization. So this is a paper I wrote with some colleagues on how the US has become dramatically more polarized over the last 40 years. And what you can see is that we're at our highest levels of polarization. It's not just that we're polarized, though. It's not just that we disagree on topics. I actually think like healthy debate on differences of agreement is valuable and critical and important. In fact, the lifeblood of democracy. What we're talking about here and what's been driving the polarization over the last 4 decades is about outgroup hate. So people's love for their own party and support for the policies of their own parties remained actually fairly stable over the last 4 decades. What's different and what's underlying the polarization that we're seeing now is outgroup hate. That in fact, it now outstrips in-group love or in-party love in terms of people's political decisions. And so when you're deciding who to vote for, you might even vote for somebody who you don't like simply because you want to stop the other party from taking power. This means you support corruption. It means you'll stand by, well, there's misinformation being spread by the people you support. And this affects all kinds of political decisions and not just in voting. I think that's like a common example of one that we talked about in this paper, but in terms of who you believe and who you trust and what information you're going to act on. Next slide. And what my research has been doing is looking at the psychological element of that. In particular, when you are highly identified with a party under conditions of polarization, this motivates you to align your beliefs with and search out information sources and believe those information sources for credible sources that align with that identity that you have. And when these are really strong, in other words, when you're highly identified, these goals to be a good group member and have your group be correct can override your goals to be accurate. So as scientists, a core part of our identity is being accurate. And if you're not accurate, you'll get your papers rejected, you might lose your job, you'll lose professional opportunities. But for most people, these incentive structures are different. And especially for highly identified or hyper-partisan individuals, the accuracies to believe things that align with party leaders or party members can outweigh your accuracy goals. And this can in turn shape this cognitive apparatus that we have that determines what we remember, what we pay attention to, how we reason about things, and so forth. Next slide. And so we've been studying in my lab, and many other labs have found similar results at this point, how this has played out during the pandemic in the US. And so in a paper we published last year, we were able to track people's movement of 15 million smartphones per day over several months. And what we saw emerging, even in the earliest stages of the pandemic, was that counties that supported or voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton in 2016 exhibited 14% more movement. In other words, before the pandemic, they had similar amounts of movement and similar amounts of movement to the previous year. But as the pandemic spread, in part because of the messaging and what sources people trusted in terms of what messages they believed, Clinton supporting or blue counties were more likely to engage in spatial distancing or social distancing. And in fact, this gap between blue and red counties and blue and red states rose over time. So even though you might expect that as people learned more, they got more education, more knowledge, maybe people in their neighborhood became infected, the local news and hospitals were putting out notifications about the need to follow these guidelines. If anything, partisanship even mattered more under those circumstances. And it wasn't just a red versus blue divide. If you lived in a slightly red county, you tended to be the same as a slightly blue county. But if you lived in a deep red county, your behavior was radically different from someone who lived in a deep blue county. And so it's not just that there's a red-blue divide, but it's the degree of commitment and support and people who align with these parties matters a great deal. And so it turns out that this was turned out to be quite dangerous because we were able to track, a week later, infections in those counties that were not engaging distancing rose. And then about 2 weeks later, you start to see mortality growth rates increase. And so as we know, or as we might expect, which is the reason for encouraging people to engage in spatial distancing and other public health practices, we did it to reduce infections and mortality. And places that did not do this, in what we determined were largely for political reasons, and partisanship was one of the single biggest predictors of the model, bigger than racial or ethnic demographics of that county, bigger than economic factors, It mattered over and above things like population density, which people thought would matter a great deal. Partisanship was one of the single biggest predictors over this time period, and it had these, was correlated at least with these downstream consequences. Next slide. The other thing we found is that you can link this to the messaging people receive. So in our data, we found that one of the biggest predictors was were people getting their news from Fox News as opposed to CNN and MSNBC. That almost fully accounted for the difference we were seeing in willingness to follow spatial distancing guidelines. We weren't able to have social media data for this analysis, but I'll show you for other studies we've done soon. Next slide. Now, moving to social media, the dynamics of social media are important to understand in terms of what goes viral, what do the algorithms reward, and also what is our internal psychologically encouraging us to reinforce. And so what we found, this is a paper that came out this summer, right before the whistleblower for Facebook came out, was that basically outgroup animosity is what drives engagement on social media, what people are likely to share and engage with. And anger was one of the most powerful emoticons. If people were putting like angry emoticons, it was most likely to spread. And so messaging, especially misinformation, often travels on these vectors. And so this means a lot of messaging is about distrust of elites or distrust of political parties around COVID, around guidelines, around the vaccine. It's one of the reasons in another study I don't have time to show you today, we've seen the same patterns for distancing now with vaccinations. That one of the single biggest predictor of vaccination rate across the country is the partisan breakdown of the county that they're in. So, and that matters way more than things like that we might expect, like gender or racial ethnicity in a county. Next slide. I'm also going to point to you that it didn't have to be this way. So if we looked at data in Britain versus, the UK versus the United States, and we tried to look at vaccine hesitancy of individuals and map it to who they followed online. The first thing you see is that it was actually really politically polarized in the US, but not in the UK. So if you look at the map of vaccine hesitancy, which are the pink clusters, you see that a lot of them are very political accounts, like Donald Trump Jr., Sean Hannity, again, Fox News, Tucker Carlson. It's not just that these people are spreading these messages and rhetoric on TV at night, is that they're amplifying it on social media. A lot of times there's actually an iterative relationship where they're getting misinformation from social media, spreading it there, and then amplifying it when they go on TV at night. And so people who are following them are much less likely to plan to get a vaccine or have gotten a vaccine than, say, people who follow like the White House account or credible news sources like Washington Post or politicians like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren or Michelle Obama. Those were individuals who had large followings of people who were very low in vaccine hesitancy. And you just simply don't see that polarization in other countries, even though they are polarized, for example, in the UK around Brexit. They just haven't had the same polarization of the rhetoric around the pandemic. So the messaging of leaders matters. I'll go to the last slide and then I'm done. The key thing I'm trying to say here is that when you have polarization, you have a context that can undercut all kinds of public health messaging and behavior. And this is especially true when leaders, whether these are political leaders, Donald Trump, for example, or elites, so like Sean Hannity, are downplaying the risks. And they tend to amplify these messages on not only on TV, and you can trace that directly to the real world behavior and infections and mortality, but you can also see it in the social networks and people who follow them online because they're amplifying these messages or getting them and blasting them online as well. And so it's very hard now to think about communication as excluding these two things. Online and TV and mainstream messaging are actually tightly interwoven. And then the last thing I want to say is that it didn't have to be this way. So I showed you the data in UK is not polarized. The same thing happened in Canada. Although Canada is increasingly polarized over the last few decades, there was a really cool paper analyzing the rhetoric of political leaders in Canada, and whether they were from the Liberal Party or Conservative Party, they both had messaging that took the pandemic seriously. And then when you looked at national representative surveys of Canadians, you found that it didn't matter what their political leaning was, if they were liberal or conservative, they took the pandemic seriously. And so this is why there's a capacity to leverage social media for good in these contexts, but when it's not, you see the behavioral and infection consequences and vaccine rate consequences we're seeing in the US. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jay. That was great. Next, we'll have Katja.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak at this really interesting event. This was fascinating to watch so far. Over the next few minutes, I do want to talk about a little bit about trust in institutions and highlight connections to misinformation, health behavior, and social media. Next slide, please. So before I start, I should mention that much of the data that I'm going to present is coming from the COVID States Project. I'm one of the co-leads of this large multi-university initiative, which collects data about the opinions, the attitudes, the behavior of Americans since the beginning of the pandemic. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see we collect large survey data of Americans across all 50 states with about 20 to 25,000 respondents per wave, and we launch a survey about every 6 weeks. We also get social media data, like data from Twitter. And among the key data points that we are focusing on and are really interested in, we look at Americans' trust in science, in medicine, in democratic institutions, as well as the sources of information and misinformation about COVID-19. So if we go to the next slide, as everyone knows, one key challenge that we're dealing with across Western democracies, the decline in public trust in institutions. We have been tracking trends in trust during the pandemic since the beginning of the spring of 2020, and we still see very high trust, as our first panelists mentioned, very high trust in doctors and scientists, though it has declined somewhat over time during the pandemic. But one thing that I want to highlight here, and that we see over and over again in our research, is that people tend to trust individuals. So they trust their personal doctors much more so that they trust companies like pharmaceutical companies or institutions like the CDC or the FDA. So other people have already mentioned that, and I think it's important to keep in mind. If we go to the next slide, again, as previous panelists have discussed in more detail, we see considerable variations in trust across social groups. And Jay spoke very eloquently and in detail about how politicized and polarized this pandemic has become and what that means for people's behavior. I only want to note one additional thing here. It's that Republicans do indeed trust the doctors and scientists less than Democrats do. But where we see really huge differences between those groups is not just in the trust to one's personal doctor. They emerge when we look at trust in larger institutions. So there's like a huge, close to 40% percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their trust in, say, the CDC, right? If we go to the next slide, we also mentioned the racial differences due to historically really bad experiences that the African-American community has had. And again, people already talked about the lower trust in that community, but one thing to mention here and highlight again that is that African Americans may have lower trust in medicine, but they do not distrust government agencies or the CDC, the FDA, as much as Republicans do. So there is some higher levels of institutional trust in this community, which again shows us the different sources of the distrust that we're observing in each case. And so if we go to the next slide, we see that patterns of mistrust show that people with higher socioeconomic status and older people are most likely to trust doctors as well as liberals, right? Age, race, liberal ideology are more predictive most predictive of trust in medical professionals. But if we go to the next slide, if we look more broadly at trust in science, we see that the factor that dwarfs everything else here is going to be ideology. And so if we move on to the next slide, what I really wanted to talk about in today's panel is misinformation and how it links up with trust and with health attitudes. And then we know that this is a serious problem that worries many of us. And one challenge around misinformation is that that the question of trust is truly important in that context, in that people who lack confidence in science and in social institutions are also more likely to believe false stories and conspiracy theories. And in the context of COVID-19, we see that people who trust institutions less are obviously less likely to get vaccinated or adopt other protective behaviors. And so because this pandemic is a time of extremely high uncertainty, and like previous panelists have noticed and know that people are really focusing on their social relationships and getting guidance from others in their community, and not trusting institutions so much to provide help and information. And in some contexts, this can help spread stories that are not entirely true. So our project, if we go to the next slide, we track a number of misinformation items. I wanted to highlight stories that are specifically about the COVID pandemic and in particular about vaccines. So there's a number of items that we look at, for example, things like vaccines will alter people's DNA, or they could install a microchip to track you, or they use aborted fetal cells, or they cause infertility. All of these are widely known to be accepted to be false. And if we go to the next slide, thankfully, we see that on the whole, not a lot of people believe each of those individual claims, right? So for each claim, there's about 10% of people who think it's true. And then overall, there's about a fifth of the people we surveyed who believe at least one of these things is true. So that's not so bad. But if we go to the next slide, what is kind of worse is that the proportion of people who are saying that they are uncertain about those claims. So as we can see, in total, we're looking at about 20% of people believing a false claim, 40% of people rejecting all false claims, but there's another 40% who say they don't necessarily believe those things, but are not sure. They don't know. They're uncertain about some of that stuff. Right? And the reason this is important and problematic is that if we go to the next slide, is that we find that both holding vaccine misperceptions and being uncertain about vaccines, those are both associated with the decision to get vaccinated or with the tendency to be vaccine hesitant or worse, vaccine resistant, right? So to emphasize this, we're not actually saying that misinformation is necessarily causing people to refuse vaccines. That's quite likely there's a type of person who doesn't trust social and political institutions, who doesn't trust the media, doesn't have confidence in the government or the healthcare system. And that person is likely to both hold these misperceptions and also refuse to get vaccinated. But we should say that when we run models where we account for all of those other important factors, demographics, geography, socioeconomic status, ideology, news consumption, experience with COVID, and so on, then we see three of the largest, most influential predictors of either being vaccinated or being vaccine resistant are trust in institutions, believing in misinformation, and uncertainty about misinformation, right? If we go to the next slide, we'll see that again, trust in institutions increases considerably the chances that people are going to get vaccinated, whereas misinformation or uncertainty are going to reduce those chances. And so consuming or being exposed to misinformation can not only directly convince people not to get vaccinated, but also increase their sense of uncertainty about the environment and make them less likely, more hesitant, less likely to get a vaccine. Lastly, the last thing I wanted to mention, if we go to the next slide, previous speakers have offered really important insights on the role of social media. So I wanted to just briefly touch on that as well. One thing that we do track in our research is where people find information about COVID-19. And we know that people who distrust institutions and distrust science, especially on the right, especially who are conservative, they tend to have really low trust as well in mainstream media. So that means that they get a lot of their health information from their social ties, right, from niche websites or on social media platforms, right? So if we go to the next slide, when we look at our survey respondents, we see that about a fifth of them are telling us that they rely exclusively on Facebook for COVID-19 news and information, or have relied on Facebook and not other sources in the recent past. And what we also see, if we go to the next slide, is that compared to people who do get their news outside of social media, people who get their news on Facebook show significantly lower trust in institutions and are less likely to be vaccinated, right? And so again, if we go to the next slide, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's Facebook making people, not trust institutions or causing anti-vaccine attitudes. But it does show that there's this considerable group of Americans who distrust institutions, who resist vaccination, and who are using Facebook as their primary source of news and information. They're avoiding mainstream media, right? And so obviously that both creates challenges for the platform, since this group can spread anti-vax messages on the platform, but it's also a really interesting opportunity to reach a population, and as Robin mentioned, that is isolated from other forms of mass communication, to use the platform for good. And so I will stop here. And if people want to see more on that topic, they can read our reports on covidstates.org or reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat.
Thanks so much, Katya. That was fantastic. Now we'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, everybody. And Allison, there's a lot of slides here, so I'm just going to ask you to advance the slide anytime there's a long enough pause. But it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I'm a practicing internist, a historian. I direct the Institute for History of Medicine and the Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And I want to provide an insight into what history, anthropology, social science of medicine can provide in this kind of conversation. And my first few books cover the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the circulation of medical knowledge. But my current research focuses on how medicine faces the challenge of new media. And in this conversation, new social media have become a problem, a source of new forms of misinformation, which can spread as virulently, if not more virulently, as epidemic viruses like Zika or COVID-19. New media, go back to that last one. New media aren't as new as we think they are. Alternately, many of the media of knowledge communication we think of as old media, right? Newspapers, medical journals, radio, were once new, right? And when they were new, they also posed challenges as well as opportunities to the spread of medical knowledge. And here's an illustration called The Doctor of the Future from the German Jewish illustrator Fritz Kahn. It's from 1939. So as a historian of medicine and new media, I want to try and differentiate some of the new problems that social media pose for credibility of scientific knowledge and its use in medicine and public health from the older problems of ideology and scientific skepticism that have been with us well before Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. I'll just ask for the next one. That being said, new social media do pose unique problems for the circulation of credible knowledge. And this is something that my colleague Aaron Kesselheim at Harvard and I have been following for more than a decade, trying to understand what problems new social media pose for, say, the regulation of scientific knowledge by the FDA. But I want to walk through this with a recent example, and this is ivermectin, if we have the next slide. And then again to the one after that. Very few of us in this meeting will have escaped some media coverage of how ivermectin, once an innocuous heartworm medication or an icon of global health delivery programs for African river blindness, has become a flashpoint for the culture wars over trust and distrust, information and disinformation, and the role of social media in the viral propagation of scientific skepticism in the current moment. The use of the drug was the subject of a Senate hearing under Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican from Wisconsin, in late 2020. But like so many aspects of the current pandemic, it really flared to the front this summer in July as clinical trials failed to demonstrate that the generically available anti-parasitic drug had any relevant antiviral action against coronavirus infection. Have the next slide. As the New York Times reported in August, quote, one of the largest trials studying ivermectin for COVID-19 treatment, the Together trial, was halted by the Data Safety Monitoring Board on August 6th because the drug had been shown to be no better than a placebo at preventing hospitalization or prolonged stay in the emergency room. And they interviewed Edward Mills, a professor at McMaster University who led the study, which enrolled more than 1,300 patients, who said the team would have discontinued it earlier were it not for the level of public interest in ivermectin. Here, have the next slide. Yet popular interest remained high. People kept buying veterinary ivermectin without prescriptions, which became colloquially known as horse paste, and occasionally poisoning themselves with it. In the United States, it was very popular in Latin America and many other parts in the world as well, but in the United States, it was not enough for the United States Food and Drug Administration to take to the relatively new media of its website to insist that ivermectin did not treat or prevent COVID. The next one, the science-based regulatory agency, and this based on what Catherine was just noting, took to Twitter at the end of the summer to remind American consumers, quote, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it." And the next slide here, all the while state legislatures continued to argue that access to ivermectin was a right that needed to be protected by new state laws. A judge in Ohio ordered a hospital to administer ivermectin over the protests of local physicians and state and federal regulators. And this judge was acting on the recommendation of an iconoclastic physician, Dr. Wagschul, a leading proponent of ivermectin in Dayton and founder of the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, who wrote the prescription for the drug. And as the New York Post reported, Wagschul told the Ohio Capitol Journal that there was irrefutable evidence supporting the efficacy of ivermectin against COVID-19 and alleged a conspiracy to block its use by the CDC and FDA to continue its authorization of the available coronavirus vaccine, so that ivermectin became tied to forms of vaccine resistance. So if we move on, reporting on ivermectin was saturated with political polarization that Jay talks about. Those who watched CNN saw in the ivermectin episode a critique of the right-wing media, a willful spread of disinformation, and an undermining of established scientific practices. We can move on. So did readers of the New York Times. But for those who principally turned to Fox News or the New York Post, if we can have the next slide, a different picture emerged, one of skepticism of the truth claims of the mainstream media around efficacy, safety, individual choice, and the dangers of public health. And I think we need to take this seriously. Listen to what the New York Post says. The New York Post reporting emphasizes that data on ivermectin was being suppressed because unlike the brand name patent protected COVID vaccines, ivermectin was a cheap generic drug that threatened the oligopoly of Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. Nobody, they pointed out, received a profit from generic ivermectin sales. Here's a quote, "Just 8 of 573 patients who received ivermectin passed away," the New York Post reported, compared to the 44 individuals out of 510 who died after being given a placebo. Reporting on Fox News emphasized the cheap price of the drug between $17 and $43 for a course of treatment. The next slide. In accounts of the polarization of scientific knowledge, it's popular to blame the polarization of popular media, and both Jay and Catherine are giving us examples of this, which has accelerated since the rise of the major cable news networks. In the next slide here, we've been talking today about the polarizing effect of social media through which many claims of ivermectin have passed. But if we are to make accurate claims about what has changed with new social media, if we could advance the slide, we may also need to attend to what has not changed, right? Ideological divides over unproven therapeutic agents are nothing new in American society. They well predate COVID and Facebook and Twitter and Insta. I'm going to linger on one that many of you will remember, which is the fight over Laetrile as a cancer agent in the 1970s. Now, for those of you who don't know the Laetrile story, hundreds of thousands of Americans consumed Laetrile, an extract of apricot pits, to treat cancer in the 1970s, even though the FDA explicitly denied any proof of efficacy and systematically worked to shut down Laetrile access during the decade, and clinical trials did not show efficacy either. Laetrile, or amygdalin, is a substance derived from apricot pits that was used speculatively for treatment of a variety of cancers from its discovery and promotion in the late 40s, early 50s, especially in the 60s by a father and son team. The FDA found it neither safe nor effective, repeatedly denied its approval or use as a new drug. Yet it was cheap and easy to produce and became the basis of a vibrant production and smuggling operation. And a number of cancer survivors claimed that their health was entirely due to Laetrile consumption. If we can move to the next slide, I want to focus the culture war over Laetrile heated up in earnest after the 1972 arrest of the California physician John Richardson for selling and distributing an unapproved therapeutic agent. Richardson, facing loss of his medical license, alleged that Laetrile was cheap, effective cure for cancer, and that any statements to the contrary were the results of a vast anti-Laetrile conspiracy that involved the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the American Medical Association, the American Cancer Society, and the National Cancer Institute. Richardson was a deeply conservative physician and a member of the anti-communist John Birch Society, no relation to the John Birch who's been taking part of this conversation. He founded the Committee for Freedom of Choice of Cancer Therapy, which became a magnet for pro-Laetrile activists, including anti-government extremists and the religious right. If we can advance, but I want to point out, here's where the story differs, right? As Laetrile battles soon erupted in state legislatures around the countries, where scientists, public health officials, FDA regulators explained the lack of any evidence of efficacy, and then were countered by cancer patients and survivors with testimonials demanding the right to choose their own therapeutic agents. We see here Laetrile, like ivermectin, initially circulated through conservative Republican groups, but Laetrile advocates soon spanned the whole political spectrum of left and right. In a 1977 poll, 58% of Americans supported the legalization of Laetrile, while only 28% opposed. And this really broke down evenly on both sides of the aisle. If we move on, there's this bipartisan nature of anti-scientific Laetrile advocacy could be seen in Congress, where the Representative Stephen Sims, a Republican from Idaho, introduced federal legislation to allow all Americans to have access to Laetrile in 1977 with co-sponsors, including the deeply conservative Republican Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi and the progressive Democrat Shirley Chisholm from New York, and both as initial sponsors, ultimately joined by 106 members of Congress from both parties. So if we move ahead, FDA officials and members of the mainstream press, especially the New York Times, almost all of the New York Times reporting of Laetrile expresses kind of befuddlement as why anybody believes in Laetrile in the first place, since the scientific evidence never supported it, and why it was so deeply polarizing to American society. But that polarization didn't break down on left and right. It wasn't going away. Each year, some 20,000 American cancer patients continued to seek off-label Laetrile cures until the case finally went to the Supreme Court in 1979. This finally tipped the balance to the FDA to effectively shut down Laetrile access in the United States. Now, that was a quick encapsulation. The next slide, just to say, what are some of the features of similar features of trust and distrust between Laetrile and ivermectin? Now, we can talk about how, and I'm going to advance these really one at a time. Each of the advances just brings up a bullet point. But on the one hand, we can talk about both cases have a profound skepticism of science-based regulation of a popular drug. Both involve unbridgeable divides between scientific, regulatory, and expert knowledge on the one hand, and popular testimonials on the other. Both involve widespread denial of the role of clinical trials in demonstrating efficacy, critiques of mainstream media as complicit in a medical industrial system, conspiracy theories in which the FDA, the AMA, and the NIH are colluding in order to protect a higher priced approved therapeutic agent, and also heroic figures of iconoclastic physicians that are penalized for daring to speak against orthodoxy and prescribe cheaper, putatively effective therapeutic agents, as well as substantial political controversy involving executive, legislative, and judicial branches of both state and federal governments. And we see these features in 1977 just as much as we see them in 2021. What's different? Well, here I want to focus on what is really new about distrust through social media in this moment. And one is that the media content, this is the next slide, please, is user-generated rather than professionally generated. So when we talk about what is the media, well, there's a different sense of who's an author and who has a platform to circulate. This leads to a velocity and scale of media circulation that is unprecedented, as the prior commentators have noted, a polarization of issues directly incentivized by the media platforms themselves that becomes a driver of revenue for the media, and an ability to fact-check and monitor fact-checking processes that is totally compromised by the sprawling and ungovernable nature of the media itself. Linked to an increasing linkage of media sources with pre-existing political ideologies that create echo chambers in which the framing of factual knowledge is radically different and non-overlapping. Now, in the 3 slides I have remaining, I just want to say, the next slide, please, it's easy to blame Facebook and Twitter. And yes, as we've learned very clearly in the past month through popular reporting, they are really quite reprehensible organizations that have clearly established business models that prey on stoking ideological divides. And also the viral spread, if we could have the next slide, of misinformation, while only belatedly and begrudgingly accepting responsibility for fact-checking. New media have definitely produced new problems for the politics of medical knowledge, which in the COVID area increasingly reflect widening political landscape of blue versus red that Jay points out. But while we can look back with nostalgia to an era in which newspapers used to separate fact from opinion, we should remember that the genesis of newspapers as a new media, if we can have the next slide, in 19th century American public life, was also rooted in partisan bubbles every bit as strong as the echo chambers we now inhabit in digital media. And I'll point here to this book from historians Glenn Altshuler and Stuart Blumen, that the division of fact and opinion that became a mainstay of professional journalism in the mid-20th century, which we are now nostalgic for, was itself a reaction to this intensely partisan newspaper world that preceded it in the mid-19th century. So my final slide here is just a different kind of comparison, which is to say, all of the differences that we're talking about, if we can advance the slide, a comparison of Laetrile and ivermectin can lead us to despair that our informational worlds have become hopelessly polarized due to the new media world we now inhabit. But the same could have been said in the late 19th century. All of these differences I pointed out before are true, are actually linkages between the world of 19th century partisan newspapers and the 21st century social media bubbles we now inhabit. So what brought us out of that, right? And if we can go to the ending slide, I make this last comparison to point out that history is not a straight line. It's not just that our professional media have degenerated from the mid-20th century ideal to the cacophonous present, right? It's more cyclical. We've been in this kind of nadir before, and we've come out of it before. And I want to emphasize, as Robin and Jay have emphasized, there's nothing inevitable or immutable in the negative impact social media have had on trust in biomedical science and public health. What matters is what we do now to build trustworthy networks for information about the consensual reality we want to share. And thank you so much for providing time for me to talk, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jeremy. So we have two reactors to respond to Wendy King and Tara Haley. And let's start with Wendy King, Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health. Wendy.
You're on mute. Wendy, I believe you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. Let me try again.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Thanks to Robin, Jay, Catherine, and Jeremy for such interesting talks this afternoon. I'll try to add to this discussion by very briefly sharing a study that relates to some of the points made on distrust, political environment, and race. So the COVID Trends and Impact Survey was an online survey created by Carnegie Mellon University that was administered to over 5,000 respondents during the US vaccine rollout, basically January through May of 2021. And we used survey sampling and weighting to try to get a representative sample of the US. Respondents were asked if a vaccine to prevent COVID-19 were offered to you today, would you choose to get vaccinated? And those that said probably or definitely not were grouped as hesitant. There was a decrease in hesitancy by 1/3 January through May, which is great news, but there was very little change in the prevalence of the most hesitant group, those that said definitely not. And among that most hesitant group, not trusting the COVID-19 vaccine in particular and not trusting the government were endorsed by more than half of the hesitant respondents. This was double compared to those that responded probably not, and quadruple compared to those that responded probably yes. So distrust was playing a big part in their strong feelings towards vaccine hesitancy. Overall, half of hesitant respondents didn't trust the COVID-19 vaccine and 42% did not trust the government, versus only 15% that reported they don't like vaccines, really indicating that the hesitancy towards the COVID-19 vaccine is a distinct phenomenon from being against all vaccines in general or being an anti-vaxxer. And just like one of the presentations we heard this afternoon, we found a really strong relationship between the county political environment and vaccine hesitancy. So we looked at the percentage of Trump to Biden support in the 2020 election. And those that lived in counties with greater Trump support were much more likely to be hesitant compared to less support, even after controlling for individual demographics, socioeconomic status, geography, beliefs, and behaviors. In terms of race, we saw some good news. The racial disparity in hesitancy decreased between January and May, and that was due to large decreases among Blacks and Pacific Islanders and lesser degrees of change among whites. So actually by May, white respondents were more hesitant than Blacks in general, and particularly among older adults. However, among younger adults, Blacks were still much more hesitant than whites. So there's pockets of groups that we need to look at in particular, instead of just looking kind of at these broad groups. And not trusting the COVID-19 vaccine was still one of the most common responses in every racial group we looked at, whereas there was much more variation in not trusting the government, which was much higher among whites, multiracial groups, and Native Americans, who saw a lesser change in vaccine hesitancy through May. So I think we did see some really strong relationships between, again, the level of distrust and the degree of hesitancy and how that changed over time. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Tara?
Hi, thanks for excuse me, inviting me to talk here. It's interesting because I'm used to interviewing a lot of academics, and I really appreciate the fact that you guys were seeking sort of media input on this. because I don't think there's enough collaboration between talking to journalists and getting those perspectives on the research and vice versa. I was just going to respond to a couple things, a couple notes I took on each of the presentations briefly. When Robin was speaking about the benefits of social media, I think equitable access can't be overemphasized, and I think we don't exploit that enough, especially in reaching out to trusted messengers. I think that's something to consider, is that we have a lot more power there. And that also relates to something I thought I saw missing from the risks. I didn't see any mention on that list of how easily manipulated the algorithms are on social media, and how the combination of that with deep fakes and the difficulty of false, she did mention that false claims aren't easy to identify. I think that's really underappreciated, especially when we see the savviness that can be used with videos and deep fakes. And when we see some of that research, such as that came out from Russia, looking at how they took vaccine polarization and amplified it for the sole purpose of political gain. It wasn't even about vaccines, it was about the election. I think we aren't appreciating enough the influence of huge money organizations, both state-related and non-state related, that are playing a role in that manipulation. And that the opportunities for manipulation in that are huge. And I think that's important both for countering it and, frankly, for exploiting it. You can't beat them, join them. And part of that also taps into the fact that they can become such easy echo chambers and silos. And perhaps if it's possible to penetrate or infiltrate those silos, that could play a role. And that relates to something I'm going to get to here in a bit. I also think there hasn't been enough attention paid to the repeated exposure issues. When we know from social psychology and cognitive bias research that repeated exposure is a huge role, but we don't think about the fact that the media itself inadvertently perpetuates that when they, for example, try to debunk myths. I've done a lot of work with other journalists and training them how to properly debunk myths, which is not to restate the myth facts basically, and instead use questions, but that hasn't gotten out to enough people. And I even see institutions doing a lot of that, where they restate the misconception and then they go on to debunk it, but you've just restated the misconception. And I think that, the cognitive impact of that, I just looked at that study recently on the difference between how people respond, how clinicians respond to the use of schizophrenic versus person with schizophrenia, the classic identity first, person first. And in that study, the clinicians showed lower levels of benevolence and higher levels of authoritarianism when they read the survey using schizophrenics. And these are clinicians who are trained to overcome that bias. So that just shows that impact, I think, is really important to consider. Our rational is always going to be overwhelmed by our reptilian brain. Another knowledge gap that I didn't see mentioned there, which relates to all this, is stopping that big money or infiltrating that big money or finding ways to prosecute. I don't know the solution, but just paying attention to these large organizations, full of money. Children's Health Defense is a great example. ICANN is another great example. There's a lot of money behind those, and they are very savvy about how they manipulate that social media and create really manipulative media that is hard to see through. I mean, Plandemic was a great example of that. When Jay was talking, the biggest thing that stood out to me, one thing that stood out to me was I kept thinking, boy, the First Amendment really complicates things, doesn't it? And I say that as a journalist who's fully in favor of the First Amendment as is, but I think about that a lot. But I think something that is also underappreciated is how media inadvertently amplifies polarization because of lack of training. The biggest example of this, and this is something that health and science reporters talked about a lot throughout the pandemic, is that the White House press corps is a bunch of political reporters. And yet for the entire pandemic, it stayed being political reporters who have no clue how to report on science and health. A political reporter sees the world as a horse race. It's us versus them. And we know that science, that kind of false balance, is extremely dangerous. And yet there wasn't a big push to say, hey, maybe we should get some science and health reporters in there. So at the very least, I don't know how much we can change those kinds of institutional issues, but at the least, organizations like the FDA and the CDC and HHS can reach out to the political reporters and say, hey, listen, would you like some training on science and health, since you're now doing that and that's not your area? Offer fellowships like are already offered to science and health journalists to get the political journalists to think like a science and health journalist. I mean, it is literally the difference between thinking like a politician versus thinking like a scientist. It's a completely different way of reporting. And I think that amplified a lot of problems, even in people who meant well, even in journalists who were trying to do the right thing. In Catherine's presentation, this kind of relates to that, is I wonder, and maybe this is a pipe dream or naive, is there any way to reach out to conservative media? Is there a way to bring them into the fold in some way and kind of use relationships to at least, tilt the coverage in a direction. I don't know if there is, because the fundamental heart of all of that problem is the distrust of institutions. So an institution reaching out is going to be suspect. But I think there should be some research into, instead of just identifying them as the problem and pushing that off to the side and saying this is the problem, can we attack that problem in a more sophisticated way, I suppose, and just give more thought to that. And then Jeremy's, I loved your presentation. I a couple of weeks ago spent a lot of time on newspapers.com because I was pulling up examples of old anti-vaccine rhetoric that we saw in the late 1800s and the mid 1900s. And I think a lot of people don't realize we are seeing verbatim. I mean, you already know this, but we're seeing verbatim. I mean, when I say verbatim, I mean, it looks like the entire sentence was lifted from a 1950 newspaper or from an 1895 newspaper. I mean, literally the exact sentence. It'll be like, the vaccine is worse than the disease. I mean, word for word. I don't think there's enough appreciation for the fact that those arguments have been around forever. The problem is that the social media increases the reach and the speed so much. And I don't know what the solution to that is, because again, we've seen the huge benefits of social media. But the timelessness of this is an important thing, because it at least it reassures us a little bit that we're not dealing with something that's brand new. We're dealing with something that's sort of baked into our DNA and our neurons. And that's something we have to take into account when we're looking at the research on this, is we're not trying to outsmart the system. We're trying to outsmart our own brains. And I think there needs to be more attention taking that into consideration. I wanted to point out the FDA. I hated that that tweet, "You're not a horse, you're not a cow. Seriously, stop it, y'all," because it tapped into something that really upset me when I saw the ivermectin coverage. I was invited to speak on WHYY about ivermectin. I think it was that, I can't remember where, but it was a radio show. And I talked about the fact that a lot of the discussions about ivermectin were very mocking. And I felt that was actually very unhelpful, because if the FDA is saying, "You're not a horse, y'all, you're not a cow, y'all," all you're doing is mocking them and pushing them further away and reinforcing their belief that you don't care about what their thoughts are. And that's not helpful, especially when ivermectin is a legitimate drug. Sure, it's not a legitimate drug for COVID-19, but it's a legitimate, important drug. And we made it sound like it was only used for horses and nothing else ever. And that's really damaging, because that hurts our credibility when it makes it look as though that our, meaning people who believe in science, because I think that the implication that this is nothing but horse paste and nothing else, it invalidates that, and it cuts off an opportunity for discussion that there could have had, where it could have been, hey, this is a really important drug. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about why the mechanism it might not work for COVID-19. But first, let's talk about why it might, why we studied it in the first place. Using that as more of an opportunity for discussion and listening and validation, as opposed to just mockery, which we know, over and over and over again from research and just personal experience, mockery is not the way to win people over. It doesn't work. And then finally, with that media polarization of ivermectin, again, I think political reporters played a role in that, and a lot of ignorance played a role in that. So I am always going to be a huge fan of reaching out to journalists, and a lot of journalists are not going to be happy about that. It's in our nature to be just as distrustful of institutions as other. We all have that tradition of muckrakers, but I think a lot more outreach to media in trying to organize things. A great example was Medicine in the Media, which was done by the NIH for years. And I went to that boot camp back in 2012, I believe it was. Stephen, oh gosh, I've forgotten the names of the ones of the husband and wife team who ran it, but the NIH Medicine in the Media boot camp was fantastic. It was just too small. And then the government shutdown of 2013 or 14, it basically died that year and never came back. But that kind of thing I think is really important. It doesn't have to be that intensive, but we need to see more outreach like that with the media, and trying to help the media understand the kind of research you guys are showing. A lot of the media, journalists don't recognize the importance and the relevance of cognitive bias, for example, or social psychology research, or the history of medicine, all these different, soft science impacts on our hard science understanding. You guys, everyone here, I'm sure, has already been frustrated with the fact that there's a divide between the hard scientists and the soft scientists on this, but I think journalists need to be more appreciative of that. And I think it's more ignorance than anything else. And I think that's it. I went really fast, sorry.
Thank you, Tara. So we built in a little bit of a buffer so we can take this discussion to the top of the hour for a few more minutes. First, I just open up to the panelists. Both Wendy and Tara raised a lot of questions and comments that you can respond back to. So let me open up to you guys first. Maybe we'll start with Jeremy.
I've so much to talk about. These are great generative comments. I think one of the things I found myself thinking at the very beginning of Tara's comments about this problem of, well, what is new of the space we're in with deep fakes and the cognitive dissonance that exists in these spaces. And I found myself, thinking about the double bind that the lies associated with, for example, the Trump presidency put journalists in which you'd either find yourself in a position of contesting lies, which many journalists did, like calling certain things falsehoods, or and then that would get negative play, or trying to provide balance, and then the whole trap of trying to be professional journalists and providing fair and balanced reporting then led to the repetition, as you're pointing out, of lies.
And false balance, which was a huge, that was the biggest problem from political reporters, was the false balance. I would love to see one of the researchers here do a study on coverage of the pandemic by political reporters versus health reporters, like take some of the same issues or events that happened during the course of the pandemic and do sort of a qualitative analysis of the words and the language of say a science reporter and a political reporter. That would be fascinating to look at.
And this led me to this other thought, which is I love the point you're making there about the training being different, right? But is part of the problem perhaps being that one actually needs training in both to really cover this kind of reporting? And
well, I can't emphasize the importance of training enough for everybody, so I would say yes.
Great, thanks. Let me open it to Robin and Jay and Katya as well.
Well, so Tara, I wanted to tell you that the media and medicine training was back on the tracks to come back, and then COVID hit. And
oh gosh,
how
ironic. That's
right,
so
the
frustrating.
folks who were leading it were actually wanting to. I mean, what a prime opportunity! But the pandemic, of course, derailed all the in-person work that everyone was doing, and so I'm sure that NIH and NCI will try to bring that back when.
Okay, that's fantastic.
But I agree.
Yes, Steve
right?
Wilshin. That's it. I mean, his partner, unfortunately, she passed away. But yeah, Steve is fantastic, and a lot of journalists rely on him when we're trying to vet things. I mean, he gets a lot of phone calls from us.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I just think it's a space even where we think, well, the federal government, I mean, has a role to offer training and expert trainers, and also interactions with the scientists doing the work with the journalists. So again, it's a great opportunity. I hope we can get that.
And I'd like to see a lot of that focuses only on the science or understanding, for example, p-values and confidence intervals. I'd like to see some of that training also incorporate the social science research we see with cognitive bias and impact of language. That has not been present in most of that training that I've seen.
Great. Let me just ask a general question about maybe what the role of journalism is to better public message the results of research. I think Sudip made a comment about the fact that there's really good translation in science and nature with kind of lay person's description of complicated science. We don't see that in a lot of journals. And I'm just trying to understand, is that a responsibility the journal should have or more in the public journalists, but should there be a role of developing a trusted translator that takes the kind of black box of science and turns it into something that average people can understand better, rather than just say, look, the science is a black box. I never trusted those guys to begin with. I don't understand the results reading the scientific outcomes. Just wonder what you think the roles would be.
That's a really good question. And it's a question I don't think people are asking who have the ability to ask it and mean something. It used to be that, journalists were the gatekeepers for the science, right? I've been writing about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy for 12 years. And what you see more than anything else is, for example, Sherry Tenpenny's list of the 50 studies showing that vaccines are harmful. Okay. And if you've ever looked at that list and looked up each of those studies, the vast majority of those studies are evidence in favor of vaccines. It's just that people don't know how to read the studies. And I wonder, I mean, traditionally, I would say, that's really the realm of journalists and teachers and, to translate that. But in an era where information is so readily available, and especially as open access catches more steam and becomes more widely available, maybe journals do need to be thinking about like a lay person translation of the study, almost like a teaching type tool. I mean, that's very resource intensive. I don't know that journals are going to love that idea, but I do think in terms, if we're thinking from the public service end of that, that could be sort of a revolutionary idea. It hasn't been done in science before, to my knowledge. There's always been sort of a difficulty with translation from science. I mean, we see that, God, go back to the Middle Ages, look at what's his name with the ghost map, the cholera outbreak. There's always been those problems. But that's a pretty revolutionary idea. And I think it's something that needs to be seriously considered, even though it would be quite a substantial paradigm shift in seeing journals. I mean, what it would take is basically having journals hire journalists or people who are good communicators, science communicators, sort of like PIO type people, perhaps, to do that. But I think there could be a huge value in that. The hard part would be determining which studies to do that with, because you can't do it with every single study.
Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
you start building that into grants. I mean, if you start building it into a grant where every NIH grant involves, hiring a PIO or journalist or science communicator to add like the lay friendly, I mean, that's possible, but that's a big ask.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks. Any other views on that from the panel? I don't know if Joe Ross is still on, but with respect to being more transparent with data and having more public access, what do you think about the ability of the public to look at transparent information, and should there be some guidance on how that's not only the data that they get access to, but the results and how they're interpreted?
Yeah, Rick, thanks for bringing in. And one of the ways I can sort of speak to this issue is, I helped to co-found medRxiv, which is the preprint platform. So it's not just about data, but it's also about research. And it's very complicated, right? And I think that, there's got to be ways to provide access to information within the scientific community to allow us to learn from each other as quickly and expediently as possible, while also allowing public access to that information. But there needs to be kind of a cautionary principle applied to it. Hopefully, we put, kind of subheaders on every preprint that comes out through medRxiv, cautioning that this is, preliminary information. It hasn't, not only has it not been peer reviewed, but you shouldn't use it to inform clinical care decisions. Just like every other journal article that's formally peer reviewed and published. There's a challenge, and this came up in the first panel, around how to communicate science and results in a way that allows the public to kind of understand the way science is iterative and learning, but no individual study should lead to a clinical decision, or it's a pathway. But that's challenging, and that's not always easy for everybody to understand, and it's easy to grab onto one study or one piece of information and make a decision on the basis of it. But I think as science gets democratized, information is obviously more and more accessible. We have to improve the way that we communicate all this information to everybody, and not just the general public, but also non-science-based clinicians who are making decisions are just as easily swayed by individual pieces of evidence. It's complicated. I don't have an easy answer.
Can I add that an example of, I know at least one organization that is trying to do what you were just saying, Rick, JAMA, with their key points, question, findings, meaning. They could add context in there. Question, context, findings, meaning would be nicer. But those are really helpful for people who can get the full access to those. And something more like that, I mean, that's relatively straightforward and simple, but I think goes a long way. I rely on those as a journalist. But I think two other things, to Catherine's message in the chat here about not being able to reach the populations who need to see the most. I agree. And I have two thoughts on that. One is, again, it might be a pipe dream or impossible, but investigating whether it's possible, whether there are effective ways to reach out to conservative media influencers and try and work with the beast, if you will. And two, maybe doing a lot more training of community reacher outers, if you will. One of the things that I do when I write about this is, instead of writing about how, instead of trying to use my writing to persuade someone to get the vaccine, I use my writing to persuade someone who can persuade someone to get the vaccine, and sort of train people. I've had lots of conversations with people who are like, I have an anti-vaccine friend, and I talk to them about, okay, when you talk to your friend, try this. And I've had dozens of people come back to me and say that the advice I offered them on how they should talk to their friends as that trusted person, speaking to what Catherine was saying about how they trust people, I think we could do a lot more of that, I don't know, community education kind of training, how to get the public who are in those groups to reach to the people that they love and care about in their networks who are on that other side of the political aisle.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. Well, thanks so much for, Jeremy, did you want to say something?
Oh, just one extension of this as well, because I think the capacity of open data to actually recruit more people into the scientific process and the use of data, right? The question is just who becomes data, but who gets to use data is a really open question.
Yeah.
My colleague, Kim Gallen, who's a visiting professor here this year and the founder of a group called COVID Black, has been working on trying to build Black data communities, which is to say, how does one find a space in which data about COVID in the Black community is something that is used by community members in different cities in a purposeful sense, so that one is not merely a data point, but one is a data analyst. My colleague Kirsten Oster at Rice University wrote about virality in social media and Zika, showing that there's user-generated data about epidemics that starts happening, right? And part of what the question is, how do we make user-generated data analysis responsible? And I think there's a question of how do you build these on-ramps so that more people can use data once data is open, rather than simply see themselves as data points and be skeptical of the conclusions that are drawn from them. That relates back to my comments on the earlier panels as well. I think there's real work to do.
Great, thanks so much. Fantastic discussion. Wish we had more time, but we'll have to wrap up the next session. So I'll turn this back over to Rich.
Okay, so first a sound check. I was told that I was a low talker earlier. How am I doing now?
Great.
Okay, great, thank you. So just by way of recapping, there are at least 6 important themes that we have talked about during the last 3 hours. The first is the importance of health literacy and science literacy and the need to improve them. The second is the importance of developing sustained relationships with communities in order to be able to anchor both the conduct of research and the willingness to believe the results of research. The third is to both respect and acknowledge the participant of research participants as real partners in the research that's going on. The topic that we've been talking about for the last few minutes of confronting the wave of politicization, the coupling of social media with mainstream with the mainstream media and the drastic evolution of the purpose and types of social media. One thing I didn't hear us talk about was the use of social media simply to be disruptive, not really even in support of a particular political end, but the creation of botnets and the like that are solely intended to throw sand in the works. So that's an awfully big set of serious problems for us to tackle. But this is the time for this entire group of us to try and articulate some of the ways that it might be worthwhile to try to address them. Our hope is that by the time we adjourn, guaranteed to be in less than an hour now, that we might give some advice to the National Academy about avenues that it might pursue in trying to just improve the level of belief in science in general, but in particular around the pandemic. So all of the panelists and reactors, I hope you'll weigh in. granted that if you accept the idea that there are at least 6 really important themes we've talked about, where should we be going? And to the extent that you can articulate ways to approach the problem that might in principle be scalable, that would be especially useful. Let me ask, there aren't so many of us that it isn't possible to raise your hand this way, but we also have these nice yellow hands that you can raise and lower as well. So I'm perfectly happy to, I'm willing to call on people, but it hasn't been necessary for this whole afternoon. So I think the more we can have a spontaneous conversation, the better. I encourage everyone who's on this webinar now to weigh in as well. And Rick, you know perfectly well that we have a shared responsibility here to shepherd this part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the panelists. I'll just start off, Rich, by there were a couple comments made about whether we need to get a better scientific education in primary and secondary schools, so that so people understand the value of science and differentiate it from other misinformation. And I just wonder if you or anybody else thinks that might be a recommendation we have, is that we may want to think about, and I think somebody wrote, focusing on the science, not making scientists, because at the end of the day, scientific education is for people who won't be scientists, and they're the ones that are having the problems differentiating misinformation from scientific output.
Well, I'll just add that I think it's a fantastic idea, and you think about what is taught in high school, and often we forget to teach kind of some just basic knowledge that will help people be good citizens in the world. So I think this definitely falls in this category, and part of science curriculums should be incorporating how to discern what is, real scientific literature and what is not, and the influence of social media in that is definitely something that I think teenagers would be receptive to and interested in learning about.
So, oops, I'll lower my hand. I wanted to add 2 things to that. One is that there are also ways, if we look at kind of intermediaries, to reach out to patient advocates, patient groups, and teach them things that they can then bring out to their community. So the first advocacy project I did was a magazine for women with breast and reproductive cancer. And we did an article on epidemiology for breast cancer advocates who are interested in research advocacy. So I think there are different levels of training. And then, as I think the role of the university, college, whatever you go to, is to teach you how to learn. And so you should also learn how to learn about science, not just learn how to learn generally. So we need to teach people how to learn and to continually evaluate, because most people's knowledge ends at the last class they took. And for many of us who went liberal arts, I didn't take any. I took 1 science class in college. And then I think the other process thing for the National Academies is there's been a lot of work around equity and trust, and there's been a lot of work around COVID in all areas of the National Academies. And I mentioned briefly, but I just co-chaired a workshop with Reggie Tucker-Seeley for the National Cancer Policy Forum. I'm on that board, and Reggie Tucker-Seeley, who's on the board on health equity, and promoting health equity in cancer care. So a lot of the things that I brought forward were discussed in that workshop, as well as many other practical models and points of view. It was a very action-oriented workshop. So just from a sort of starting point, I think it would be good to look at all of the different things some of the different workshops that have been done, and start collecting some of those ideas, because there were some great ideas, and we want to build on and maximize everybody's ideas rather than repeat people's ideas.
I wanted to weigh in, if it's okay, on the discussion about education. Before I went into full-time journalism, I was a high school teacher, and I did a lot of teaching, and I also did a little bit of younger school teaching. And one thing that I also write children's books. I've written about a dozen science children's books, nonfiction, that are published and used in schools. And one thing that I think we don't do enough, it's started to change now, but it only started changing. The National Science Teaching Association changed this about 4 or 5 years ago, is up until very recently, science was thought of as a body of knowledge as opposed to a process for getting knowledge. And that has been the default for most of our lives, because we, the people, frankly, the baby boomers largely who are watching Tucker Carlson, they grew up with the idea of science being an encyclopedia, not science being a process that is iterative and is trial and error and is going to generate some errors along the way that is a part of the process. That sort of massive concept has not been communicated. And this is also kind of a crazy idea. I'm one of those out of the box people. Maybe scientists need to reach out to Hollywood and or some of you go into screenwriting. Hollywood is a phenomenal way to reach some of those people and actually sort of teach new ideas. I mean, Hollywood's been a leader in everything from reducing smoking to racial desegregation. It really is powerful. And there are ways to think about using that kind of media as well, entertainment and television, to teach the general public. I mean, CSI is a good example, although, well, it's a good example. It didn't do it well, but it's a good example of what I mean. In helping communicate that idea that science is a process, not a body of knowledge. I think that's something that really needs to be conveyed better.
Yeah,
Jeremy.
Oh yeah, so my comment dovetails really nicely with what Tara is saying. So it is a problem, right? So it's sort of like the sort of just say no campaign. If you teach kids that the first time they use drugs, they're going to explode, and then they wind up using drugs and they don't explode, it winds up being not an effective, strategy. And so saying science is a body of knowledge and not a process, it leads to this incredulousness when there's uncertainty to deal with, right? And the point I wanted to make here similarly is we teach science in this country as if there's a strict separation between science and social and economic processes or political process. And that if you start talking about science and politics or science and political economy, then you're a relativist, right? You're exploding scientific truth. And you don't need to do that, right? So like, I can say today, well, yes, actually the structure of clinical trials and the approval system of the US FDA does favor large capitalized pharmaceutical firms in generating knowledge, because there's more financial incentive for it. So fewer people are going to go out and seek approvals for a new use of a generic drug because they don't get a profit motive. Now, that's a statement of how the FDA is situated in the political economy of knowledge production. But that doesn't mean that if a group actually produces clinical trials that shows that a generic drug works for an off-label indication, that we shouldn't use it, right? Nor does it mean that if a group does a clinical trial and showing that a generic drug does not work for an off-label indication, that we should reject it. So there's sort of a baby in bathwater problem here because we refuse to teach science in a social context. It doesn't need to lead to relativism, but instead it leads to rejection of the entire system. So I think we need to teach that science can be in a social world and still be valuable.
Speaking of bathwater, we talked very glancingly about the extent to which concern about the profit motive somehow tilts the playing field, and that where we are in trying to control the pandemic because there are fortunes to be made. And how much weight should we give to that? We haven't really discussed it in this session. I'm interested in your views as panelists about the extent to which that's a driver of just reluctance to say, really, a booster shot after all that? It just sounds like several $1 billion more for those who are selling vaccine. So I got my booster shot. I ran as soon as so it not a problem for me. But what should we be thinking about that?
I think there needs to be more honesty about it. I, for years, would say, vaccines are not a moneymaker. It's not, pharmaceutical companies don't make vaccines to make money. And that is largely true. I mean, they're making a lot more money on other types of drugs like statins and such. but they only make vaccines because they can make money on them. That is a reality. And so it's more about, I think we need to be upfront and honest about some of that stuff. With the COVID vaccine, I've had to change that because, quite frankly, Moderna and Pfizer are making a killing right now, no matter how you look at it. And that's just a reality. And if we look, for example, at the failures of the CICP program that are going on, and we consider the fact that the, it's explicitly written into law that we can't bring suits against pharmaceutical companies, which I don't disagree with. We need to protect the vaccine supply, and we do that by making changes about the litigation system. But there's not enough honesty about how those systems work. And I think more transparency can also backfire. I recognize that. I mean, it's going to get exploited, but I don't think that's not a reason to do it, because when you look at that concerning group of uncertainty people, there's the ones who believe the misinformation. Those uncertain people are the ones we should be targeting, and they're the ones that transparency is going to matter to. I remember when Plandemic came out and I did this big piece on it, the person who reached out to me privately was my son's Boy Scout leader saying, "Thank you. I had doubts about that and I was wondering." And this is a science-based person who was questioning it. And all it took was my discussing it for him to feel comfortable knowing, okay, yeah, it's a bunch of BS. But transparency could go a long way with that big fence sitter group in the middle. Of course, the journalist would say that, right?
Anybody else want to weigh in on this particular topic? Okay, this isn't a lightning round, but what would you put at the top of the list? Life is short, and the needs are great, and the National Academy, as competent as it is going to have limited ability to address all of these things simultaneously. How would you prioritize? Jeremy, is your hand up?
Yeah. So I'll be quick. I'm not saying this is top of all in terms of overall importance, but maybe in terms of short-term, medium-term, long-term goals. I think right now is a crucial moment to say, well, we're at a mea culpa moment for many social media companies, in which they recognize that their complicity in the spread of misinformation and COVID has really been disastrous. And so this is a moment in which, if, as what happened with 19th century journalism, as journalism got professionalized from the inside. It developed a set of professional conduct standards and ethics, and distinguishing fact from opinion became a key part of that, regardless of which side of the political aisle your journal was on. So how could this happen in the social media space? And I think the National Academies should play a really strong role in saying, we want to see a robust set of guidelines, and we don't want to just trust you to do your own fact checking. We want an externalizable set of rules that the spread of misinformation will be judged by and dealt with. And that's something I really think to lean in on. This is a moment in which a lot of traction could be made there.
Great. Sandra, is your hand up?
Yes, it is. Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to go back to the points earlier about trustworthiness, and I think and make 2 points. And there's significant literature, that we have right now on sort of what are some of the things we need to do to train researchers to be more effective at recruiting racial and ethnic minority participants into studies. Ramona talked about what Jansen's been doing. And so I think there's much to be said for really changing the ability of researchers to build trust. To do that takes training. Another thing it takes is a commitment to community engagement that is hard to do on just R01s. So it really needs to be an institutional commitment. And I think one of the other pieces is, that, and we've discussed it earlier, but really formal training on communication for scientists. How do you communicate with journalists? What does health literacy mean? What's that mean? Knowing something about risk communication so that they feel more comfortable and more able to communicate in ways that are more effective than what we've seen. And I would add one more thing to that. That's also true for some of our major institutions. 2009, the then director of CDC said in April, At the start of the H1N1 pandemic, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. Things are going to keep changing. We're going to tell you new things, and just be ready for that. That made a difference. We didn't hear that so much this time, and it really hurt us. So I think learning how to talk about science as the iterative process it is and engaging communities better.
Terrific. Thanks. Tara, do you have another comment?
Yeah, I really want to reiterate what Sandra just said about formal training for scientists in communication. That can't be overemphasized enough. I mean, the work that I've seen Alan Alda's Institute do, for example, has been like the God's work. It's been phenomenal. I would say two other things. One, I would love to see a lot more outreach to people, to individuals that can influence others, and see the ripple effect that can happen when you train a community group of leaders, and then those community group of leaders train other people. We've seen so many good examples of that. There was a fantastic example in Minnesota, for example, with the Public of Health, who did training with Somali leaders when the Somali community was seeing a huge number of vaccine hesitancy numbers with MMR, and they went straight to the leaders and trained them. And I think there needs to be more of that kind of, I guess, top-down, bottom-up training. I don't know how to describe that. And then I would like to see research on three things: how that works effectively, like how to do that, and to do that to scale, which is really the difficult part there. It's the scale and the money. Two, how to reach influencers, including conservative influencers. Is that possible? Does it work? I haven't seen any research even trying to see if that's possible. Maybe it would backfire. Maybe you invite, science babe who hates what was her name, that food babe who hates the flu shot, to the FDA to talk, and then she goes and writes about all this inside info on the FDA. It might backfire, but I haven't seen any attempts at that. And I think if we don't even try to do that, we're missing an opportunity. And then more research into how we can overcome and obstruct the organizations that are manipulating the algorithms in the social media. Like, how can we overcome those efforts that the Russian groups are doing, that ICANN and Children's Health Defense Network or whatever are doing? The big money that's being used, is there a way to obstruct the way that they are manipulating algorithms and the benefits of social media? More research into that.
Great. I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to weigh in. It's not required that you pipe up during this session, but if you have additional thoughts, I'm not actually calling on you, Jay and Katya, but to what extent, given that you sort of got your finger on the pulse of just how big the problem is, to what extent do you think these kinds of solutions have a chance to make a meaningful difference?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in. I'll follow up the last comment, which I thought was good, was thinking about people are active information consumers, but we can shape what information they get. And so maybe this is where the National Academy could have some kind of relationship with social media. They're trying to improve their image, but a problem that was alluded to is that the algorithms are amplifying the wrong sorts of information and making it spread more effectively. That could easily change. So for example, I have a former PhD student who worked on their news team and was instrumental in helping them change their algorithm to amplify local news stories, which people trust, often are much less polarizing. You could do that with scientific information. So they could amplify JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine articles or papers that cite those in credible ways, and then down rate information that comes from lower quality information sources. So I think you could get a smarter audience that way by giving them higher quality information. So we talked about transparency, but transparency doesn't matter if the information doesn't trickle down to most people, I think. So that would be something that could be a technical change. It would be structural, in that it could influence the way that hundreds of millions of people get information each day about these topics. So that's what I would do. I would approach those companies and Google and Twitter and talk to them about how to work with them to ensure that the information that's higher quality, or the sources that are high quality, are uprated in people's algorithms.
Great. And as a network scholar and communication scholar, there is nothing I love to hear more than people saying that we need to focus on communication and kind of training scientists to better understand social processes. It's something that we've been trying to do with computer scientists for a while. I'm a computational social scientist, and the way that our field started was by trying to train us poor social scientists to understand computer science. And at some point it became clear that it would be very helpful for people who are going to go on and create the next Facebook to get some training in basic social science and communication, so they can understand, the social processes that they're dealing with, not just so they can manipulate them, but also so they can, benefit society. And so reaching inside communities, as both Sandra and Tara already mentioned, I think is probably the only effective way to go. We tried in the beginning of the pandemic to run a bunch of different experiments for effective messages and messengers, and the only thing that came coming back to us, is that people trust other people more than institutions, and so you have to find other people who are inside the community, who are social ties, who belong, to kind of convey your messages. And I think that's probably true. We talk often about minority communities, and kind of connecting with them. That's probably also true, as Tara was saying, about political communities, kind of more ideologically fringe communities, that there's a point in having those conversations, and we don't necessarily always try. So that's this focus on kind of on going through intermediaries inside communities and trying to convey messages that way, and the focus on communication training. I really think those are key. Those are very important.
Great. I see Robin's hand up, and then Gwen's.
Yes, thank you. I just want to make 3 quick points, and I think they resonate across all the different comments that have come in so far. So a little bit of this reminds me of a few years back with the tobacco industry, right? And where finally everything was kind of laid out to bear in the public domain of the tobacco industry documents, their strategies, their tactics, their approaches. And I think it fundamentally changed. Now, is tobacco still a problem? Absolutely, yes. Have they reinvented themselves over the years? Yes. But there was at least a sea change for a moment, and thinking about how there is manipulation behind the scenes. There is a cost, motivation there, but it was made public. And I think even if you think about campaigns like the Truth Campaign and others that really set out to focus on youth and raising their knowledge of being, targeted and manipulated, and really the just kind of deceptive methods that were being used to reach different population groups with tobacco advertising and messaging and products. So anyway, I just wonder if there's lessons to be learned from any of that. So that's one thing. The second is, again, going back to health equity and health disparities. I think we haven't probably even talked enough about how a lot of the work that's all focused is all in English, and that we have different languages, different cultures, and different platforms where none of that is being moderated or monitored or corrected, or even we have no pulse on the or no finger on the pulse of what's happening for misinformation, and particularly when it occurs in more language concordant, videos and images and graphics and text, and because that's a whole other world that we haven't even touched on today, and how that could impact trust in science and public health. And then last but not least, again, just coming from the federal government and a cancer research organization, is really at the end of the day, can we also think about these downstream effects of all of this environment that we're talking about, and the downstream effects on our health, our mental health and our physical health. And I think we'd be remiss if we don't, keep those long-term outcomes in mind.
Okay, great. Gwen, and then Ramona.
So I just want to take us back a little bit to the earlier parts of the day. And I think Ramona and I are the only people who are still on who spoke in the earlier parts of the day. But I want to go back and just encourage us not to just step right into things with changes and with incremental changes and action items, and not attend to the kind of root causes, not attend to recentering this. Actually, sorry, Sandra, you're on too. Not recentering this. We talked about trustworthiness and trust. We talked about a lot of other things, and we don't have to do things. We can do things simultaneously. We can look at some of these changes that we can make while also going back and reframing this and looking at through the lens of people who are of people in communities who've been traditionally marginalized, and not just make this about what we're going to do within this room, but also go out, go into the community, go where people are, and really, really listen. So Lisa also said in her remarks that we had to slow this things down a little bit. So I think that a lot of us feel like we are at a kind of moment of reckoning, and that there is the time is now. But the time is now doesn't mean that we have to take immediate action. The time is now that we can really take some considered action and really learn about and learn more about what we need to do, rather than just always jumping into solutions.
Yeah,
I like that,
absolutely.
Gwen. Considerate, intentional action, right? And I think that goes to what I heard Sandra mention earlier, and Tara as well too. And Sandra, I just wanted to give kudos to University of Maryland, because that's another one of our partners with their patients program, right? So not only are we going into the community and reaching the community, but we're identifying who are those subject matter experts. So we've got this pool of patient, who've been working as peers, doing health education in the community. So now we're not only using them to be that education source for the broader community, but we're flipping it now and having them be that educational source to institutions, to researchers, to clinicians. Again, talking about the bidirectional and the shared responsibility that we all have. So again, kudos to University of Maryland. Super excited to be a partner in that space. But I think, again, empowering communities while we're in there, given education and given access, that's another key component.
Yeah.
Understanding what's important to them, not just taking it from the framework of what's important to us. Understanding what patients want, how to alleviate those burdens, how to alleviate burdens of the community. So I think it's definitely bidirectional, and it also, a lot of what we need to do begins in the community. And I speak as a patient advocate and a cancer survivor, and I've seen this all evolve over a number of years, how we actually work together in a way that's most effective, most intentional, and really puts the patient at the center of the patient and communities at the center.
Gwen, I'm glad you said that, because I feel like those old commercials, the Hair Club for Men, I'm not only the president, but I'm a client. But that's how Gwen and I met, to be honest with you.
Yes.
So I'm a breast cancer patient as well too, a metastatic breast cancer patient. And in my journey as a patient, clinical trials were never offered to me. And that's even though I'm credentialed as a pharmacist, even though I have good insurance, I make good money, and I go to a NCI institution. And I found my own clinical trial through clinicaltrials.gov, only because I knew to go there. So again, when we talk about access and barriers and why underrepresentation is there, it's just not one issue. It's a broader systematic issue.
So it needs to be said that it's really easy to give advice about what a good strategy would be. And I just want to call out the fact that the several of you who have participated here have actually demonstrated how investing a lot of time and energy has really paid off. And it reflects what I think fits into this schema that Jeremy suggested, which is we should be thinking about what could make a change in the next few months, but we certainly have to think about the long game. And you've really been talking about what the long game needs to be. And we'll never be successful at the long game unless we start working on the long game now. So I think that I'll give. I know, Michael, you're going to give credit to the team who organized this meeting, but I just want to call out the sort of the thought that went into sort of bringing to the fore these different threads, all of which are going to make a difference here. Are there other hands? If not, I think we're within striking distance of being able to begin a wrap up. Rick, you're a co-owner of this session, so what's your take?
Well, I think the last session was probably what we're doing now, in asking for recommendations for the National Academy. We've got some really good ideas, obviously. I mean, I'll just throw a few things out while people are thinking about some final comments we make before we adjourn. What I learned today was just really solid evidence that the misinformation from social media and cable channels is not going to go away. That polarization is here to stay. And this is a call to action. We have to do something about this because the consequences so far have not been good. And so I think we do have to make some big moves. And I think, inclusiveness, I think, was the major theme. We have to be able to get people involved so they're not only exposed to understand what the questions are in science and how we can solve it, but to get exposed to the methodology and the rigor of science, so that they can understand that the truth is actually being derived in scientific methodology and not from hearsay. So if there are ways that we can think about ideas to get more inclusiveness, patients at every level that we've been talking about throughout the afternoon, I think will be critical. I think on top of that is going to be how do we continue to differentiate science from misinformation, again, by exposure, education, and others, to just demonstrate the fact that there is one truth, and the truth comes from scientific methodology that reduces bias. We still have a lot of work to do. I mean, there are many physicians that still don't know the difference between correlation and causation. So we're starting to get some very sticky questions being asked about health, especially with a pandemic like COVID-19. I think that we need to really work on understanding how to, again, improve inclusiveness and get more people understanding not the statistics, but understanding that there's a positive scientific methodology with rigor that results in the best answers to questions that are sticky, and not by hearsay generated in social media. So that's what I took away from today's meeting, and I was glad that we have such good data that demonstrated all of those factors, especially the runaway issue with misinformation is going on right now, that really makes us feel like we should do something very quickly to combat this this out of control runaway train. So I want to just finish up with any other comments anybody else wants to make on that, and are the conclusions that Rich and I have made on track? Are there any other things we should be thinking about? Again, we really want to communicate to the National Academy of Medicine what this disparate and broad group of participants really feel is needed for next actions. Wow, interesting.
Wait, do you want us to say something, Rick? All of a sudden I was like, okay,
absolutely. Sorry about that. Yeah, go for it. Go for
it. No, I just, yeah, I think that was a very good summary, but I also would add to bringing patients into the fold is my build the table metaphor earlier. So we don't just have to educate patients about science, but we have to educate scientists about people and communities. So I think we really have to make that core. And then the other thing I was going to say that we didn't mention at all was the lack of consistency in how race and ethnicity is measured in clinical trials and how different labs interpret race and ethnicity. And I think that has to be a really critical part of this if we're looking at it in terms of clinical trials. And identity is mutable, is mutable, and things change all the time. And my dad's Iranian. I really identify as Iranian, and up until the past year or so, there's never been something where you could say Middle Eastern / North African on any kind of demographics. And so it's so I think that there are people make decisions just based on looking at you. We know that, but I think the way that race and ethnicity is and demographic information is captured and analyzed in clinical trials is also an area to be to look at. And there's a big project going on in the NIH with this now. I think they're about to launch it and bring people into that.
Thanks so much for making that point. I'm glad that you brought that up so that we can really understand the importance of more social science on our side as well. Yeah. Other comments?
I'll say one other thing about polarization that concerns me. I didn't catch it coming up, is the push for vaccines and vaccine mandates. Part of the argument is that we've been doing this forever. I mean, I remember having vaccines as a kid at school from the public health nurse. And then I saw recent polls suggesting that now this has reduced support among Republicans for vaccine mandates on other vaccines unrelated to COVID. And so when you have an environment where people's identities and it's politically charged like this, the type of logic that would normally resonate with people to get them on board could actually have unintended backfire consequences, in part for the way that I describe polarization is that it's anti, it's negative. You do the opposite of what the other party is suggesting you do. So I think that there's like, there's certainly, someone mentioned in that there's certainly anti-vaxxers on the left, although they're for other vaccines, and traditionally they were there all along, but there's these other second order consequences that I think will persist potentially past this pandemic, and might have consequences for states and municipalities and school districts rolling back vaccine mandates and other types of public health interventions that have been quite well established and are very safe, in part as a consequence of the way that the rhetoric and the polarization of the current pandemic has unfolded. So I think that there's might be some like second order, potentially big problems that come of this, even if unless we figure out how to think through it. So that's just something on the horizon that I've seen some data and it concerns me.
This is Robin, and I would also add for us to continue thinking about the next public health crisis is just around the corner, whatever it is, whether it's another infectious disease pandemic or some other, again, public health crisis that we see. And so it always seems we're behind the curve. It always seems that way. And so we are, it's often cliche, why aren't we learning our lessons now to prepare for the future? Or why can't we be more proactive versus always reactive? And I don't know the answer to that. But I do think whatever we're learning right now in this space at this time has to help us be better prepared for whatever is coming next, because climate change, prime example. There's other things coming. If not multiple. I hate to be scare everybody, but it will happen. It's just the course of nature.
It's a really important comment that we're going to have another disaster in the future. We need to develop a framework to be able to stand up to this and not have this repeat itself again.
And I would build into this we're talking a lot about the problems of communicating science, or inclusion and diversity in scientific research, and we've talked a bit about I think Ramona and Lisa had brought up questions of how to include diversity of people participating in scientific careers as well. But there's this real challenge we've seen about the politicization of public health. We have not talked about attacks on public health personnel, or the incredible depopulation of public health offices that has happened as a result of the failure of the federal government and most state governments to shield and support public health officials in this process. So to the extent that we talk about the intersection of science, medicine as part of public health, what can we do through this conversation? What can the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine do to help insist on a full-throated defense of support of science-based public health and public health officials, which there was just a shameful lack, not just lack of support, but active undermining. So I just want to point that out, because that follows consequentially right from what Rob was just saying.
Thank you, Jeremy. Other comments?
I think someone said that already, but just to highlight it again, this idea that people have quite low tolerance for uncertainty. And so one of the things that we need to communicate better is science as a process versus science as a set of facts that we already know in advance of everything else that's going on. Because one of the sources of distrust in institutions recently during the pandemic was this shift in communication about what people were supposed to be doing, and that caused a lot of challenges in not just in one community but across the board. People are not used to getting instructions, science changing, science evolving, and so we're clearly not communicating that quite well enough, that science is just the best explanation that we have at the current moment, and tomorrow is another day. So I think several people talked about this, but it's something that's important to learn how to deliver and communicate.
I think that's a really important point, and I think it goes to Robin's comment and Gwen's comment about the need for more social science. I think your comment that people want things to be binary, they want to know the answer all the time and not tolerate uncertainty, is something that we also have to process in any of our solutions. Is that either how do we communicate that uncertainty is all right, or how do we try to avoid the conveyance that science is uncertain? Any other comments? Rich, you any more to say?
It's time to declare victory. This has been this has been a wonderful session. Yeah, I have to tell you personally, I was a little concerned that we scheduled 4 hours with no break, and but we clearly would have talked right through it if we had scheduled one. So I sure want to just express my own thanks to all of you for making this such a successful and useful discussion. And Michael, I think it's time for you to take the reins.
Well, one cannot do justice in any way, shape, or form to the richness of the conversation. You folks are really extraordinary, and the skill of our facilitators and chairs as well. I did jot down a few things that I heard about the basic assumptions that we're engaging and about some of the possible actions, and I'll just pull, not quite arbitrarily, but possibly more arbitrarily than it should be, from the myriad insights and wisdom elements that you've shared. On the assumptions front, it's very clear that we need to start with the understanding that how people learn is critical, and understanding the learning process really is the beginning point of everything we do. Most people do understand that science is iterative, but they may not understand how that plays out in any individual circumstance. So we have to be thoughtful about how it's translated. Strategies vary by the proximity of the message to people's daily lives. Hence the difference between distrust in biomedical science in some cases, or myths in biomedical science and in other sciences. It's really in some ways about balancing four elements: truth, uncertainty, myth, and where people are in their lives. We heard clearly that it's important to repeat the truth and not the myth as we're trying to message. Mocking is not a viable strategy. As important as the message is the messenger, obviously. And a portion of the population will actively resist under almost any circumstances. And we need to understand who and why they are, and account for them in one way or another. well, there are many, many other assumptions that you laid out as sort of givens where that we need to keep in mind. In terms of actions, I'm a little reluctant to talk about actions with a group that is so wise and insightful and experienced with respect to actions in communication. Maybe I'll start with the notion that we need to elevate communication science in many ways. The national academies should understand and act upon the fact that communications is the basic science of societal progress and engage the issues much more systematically and in a structured fashion. Our near-term strategy clearly has to be focused on topics that we have to engage in order to counter myths and be topic specific at some fundamental level, while we also learn along the way and steward the longer term issues as well, the longer term elements of how we build a learning society, how we develop literacy as a fundamental asset and not a detriment to society. In this respect, it's clear that we have to do better within the academies to capture the lessons learned from our various discussions. We had reference to 2 or 3 related discussions just in the last several months that the academies have sponsored. And it's clearly time for us to be as systematic as we can about gathering those lessons learned. In effect, to begin to assemble the tools chest. What we're learning about the essentials of what to do and what we're learning about the essentials of what not to do as we seek to improve the application of the tools we have. Part of that requires us possibly to more formally engage the notion of the taxonomy of links between audiences, tools, and craftspeople involved, or the messengers. But building that matrix is going to be critical. And I'll bet that a number of you have done it yourselves. And so we'll have some good starting points on that count. And similarly, we'll want to maintain a living repository of what we are learning about audiences, about tools, about those who are wielding those tools. That can be a resource, and by living, I mean, this is we're far past the time when repositories are in stacks and libraries, but clearly we have the opportunity for a networked living repository that we need to work with our colleagues on thinking more about. The notion of building networks of stakeholder organizations, of messaging activators, if you will, the notion of training people to go out in different circumstances and carry messages. So those are both the notion of change processes and change agents that have to be part of our lexicon as we engage these things. And as we do for any field of science, as we try to nurture and steward it, the ongoing issues of rallying, of refreshing and sustaining will clearly be important. And most important is our ability to continue to draw upon your wisdom and to ensure that as we do, we express the kind of gratitude that you deserve and you have certainly for what you've brought here. So we'll look forward to continuing to engage on these issues. We invite you and urge you to continue to have your comments and suggestions coming in to us, and we'll try to feed them back as we get them. We'll develop a summary. I use this "we" term very casually. The people who will be developing the summary and trying to do a much better job of capturing the key lessons are those who have pulled this together. And I'll give special kudos to Laura Adams, a special advisor to the Academy, Elaine Fontaine, Noor Ahmed, Associate Program Officer, Asia Williams. Well, you see their names there, Mike Cocciola, Allison Lester. Deep thanks to each of them. Equally deep thanks to each of you. And of course, robust applause for our two co-chairs. And thanks very much. To be continued. Stay in touch, be well, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Michael.
Right.
Yeah.
Bye,
thanks.
everyone. Bye. Thank you.
That was a wonderful conversation.